In a world where points depend on hinges,
there are hinge points inside us all.
history on a Segway.
It's overdetermined.
We are the points that our hinges have been seeking.
What this podcast asks is, what if?
Agriculture, fail or epic win?
What if it was Johnny Mango Pit?
What if the Ottomans had AK-47s?
Maybe climate change was a good idea.
What if the Ottomans had lightsabers?
What if the buffalo killed us?
What if Santa Claus was real, like an actual guy who gave presents every year? This is Hinge Points.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second season of Hinge Points. I'm Danny Bessner, usually of the American Prestige podcast, but I am back here to discuss with my friend Matt Christman the various hinge points in history. And just to give everyone a little bit of a guidance, hinge points don't really refer necessarily, at least, to alternative histories, but rather we're drilling down on specific moments or specific alternatives that we believe help us illuminate larger social processes. So that will include an element of alternative history, but it's more an element of these big moments where things maybe could have gone in a different direction. And that's really what we're going to be doing here on the second season of the show. And we're also going to be having more guests than we did last time to hopefully get people with specific expertise in given areas to help us think through some of these large historical problems. And for this first episode, Matt and I are overjoyed to welcome to the podcast producer Chris Wade of the Chapo Trap House podcast. Chris, thanks so much for joining us.
Folks, they're hinge points. We love the hinge points. The points where history hinges. We love looking at them and focusing on them and figuring out what they mean.
Exactly. And we thought Chris would be an especially good person to bring on the show because of the topic we're going to talk about today, which is...
I'm blushing. I was blushing a little bit when you said specific expertise because I think that way overshoots me. Though a bit of Chris lore, I do have an undergraduate degree in history with a focus on European medieval history, as much as my undergraduate would allow, which I believe was like 2 courses, one of which was medieval sexuality.
Oh,
so
yeah.
Sounds hot, right?
Oh,
so
yeah.
I'll be trying to bring all of that memory back to this.
And that's why we had you on. And so today, the hinge point we're going to be talking about might be a bit arcane for some of you, but we actually think it's really crucial to understanding the specific historical trajectory of modern capitalism in Europe and beyond. And that is Doggerland. So what is Doggerland? Doggerland was basically the land bridge that existed between the modern UK and France in the English Channel. And about 8,000-ish years ago, it was filled in by rising sea levels. But what we're going to talk through on this podcast episode in particular, is what if Doggerland was never filled in? In other words, what if the United Kingdom never became an island and was actually always connected to continental Europe? And we think this would have enormous implications for the history not only of the UK, but global capitalism writ large. So just to set the scene, Matt, this is probably for you. Why is Doggerland important? Why is England being an island specifically crucial to the development of capitalism itself?
Capitalism, like any biological system, has to emerge in a certain band of conditions, a Goldilocks zone. And in Europe, that Goldilocks zone was provided by the specific conditions of England, which allowed it to exist at like a level of state capacity because of its separation from like continental rivals, that allowed it to experiment, and to allow the sort of destabilizing things that like larger powers refuse to countenance because of their role in undermining like legitimate authority. Those sort of innovations were encouraged in the UK, specifically because they were this country that was able to basically punch above its weight continentally and compete with other powers rather than be cowed by the other ones, which it would have been if it had just been another province of the Low Countries or whatever.
So it's really crucial, I think what Matt is saying is that the isolation of England allowed for the particular conditions that enabled the rise of a particular form of capitalism that eventually took over the globe. There were obviously other capitalisms elsewhere, but it's in England where we get that form, that most advanced form that eventually comes to dominate the United States and North Atlantic world writ large, and through colonialism, the world itself. So getting rid of England, what we're going to propose on this podcast as an independent space, is really crucial to changing the course of modern capitalism.
I also don't think it could be undervalued how much having to compete as a naval power and focus on the seas is essential to the history of England, which would be radically different if it, again, was just another one of these continental powers.
And this also raises interesting questions about Ireland. You know, if Ireland is now the island facing Europe, does capitalism develop there? Does a different form of capitalism develop? Which is something that we'll be exploring. But because this is such an ancient change, you know, this happened 8,000 years ago, there's a lot of different potential hinge points that emerge from it. So, Chris, why don't you start with the first one? And that relates to Roman rule.
Yeah. So when you guys proposed this to me, I thought it was a great idea. And it is probably the most sweeping one that you've proposed in this series, just because, yes, this concept of the Doggerland never being filled in immediately drifts all of European history, Western history, world history into the realm of almost pure fantasy speculation. But hey, it's our podcast and we can do whatever we want. So the way that I tried to conceive of how you would go about talking about this is trying to break down modern, or at least, post year zero England into 4 kind of crucial historical moments, which I can list off now, and then we'll get into each of them individually. And the ones I thought were the first, Roman rule, the Roman invasion and conquest or subjugation of England and its subsequent collapse as a political entity, the timeline that would take. Then following that, the various medieval invasions, the Saxons first, followed by the Vikings and Danes in the early medieval era. And then following that, the prolonged conflict with continental France in the 100 Years' War period and kind of the late medieval era. And then finally, focusing in on England's development as a colonizing power and empire in the early modern age. So those are the 4, top discussion points I have. And basically going back to the first one, Roman rule. Okay, so there's a land bridge to Britain. It seems to follow that Roman occupation would probably come quicker and be more complete. It would stand to reason then that after the collapse of Rome or the Gothic invasions, Britain would end up looking a lot more like the areas closer to the center of empire, like Gaul, Spain, or the other Mediterranean polities. So that's where I just kind of want to start this. And maybe it starts with, would Rome get to England faster and conquer it more completely?
And what's particularly interesting to me about this potential hinge points is, what if the collapse doesn't come like it does? Because I think what's really crucial to the future of British history is that collapse happens. So you get this mixing of Celtic cultures and Roman cultures, which develops that pure stew that is England. So what if England effectively serves as like Gaul? You know, what if Gaul is governed by the Romans for hundreds of more years? I think that's actually really interesting, because you don't get together the particular concatenation of factors that basically make the United Kingdom a province. And more importantly, and Matt, this is what we always talk about, you get that early medieval period. It's very different because you don't have Northumbria, you don't have Wales all fighting each other necessarily, because I think that conflict is really crucial to developing the particular character of what would later become the United Kingdom and British capitalism.
Yes, because as you said, the character of the collapse of the Roman Empire was a catastrophe in the British context, which created a vacuum that was filled by competing powers from Northern Europe, all fighting each other, as you said, and failing to assert like a central authority and only doing so through like this hundreds of years process of small scale warfare. And if you have a more integrated Brittany into the Roman Empire with a less dramatic drop off when the central authority of Rome collapses, then like maybe you have a more stable polity there. That, I mean, is the implication there that like the land contained by the Mediterranean, the Alps, and the Pyrenees would be like some sort of super state, like a precocious super state because of that? I don't know.
Yeah, like what if you get in the Western Empire, your version of like Byzantium? You know, what if the Holy Roman Empire actually encompasses everything to the west? And then it's so interesting because then you don't get what if Charlemagne is able to control the United Kingdom? Right. And what if you get this pseudo feudal territory that isn't able, I think, to contain itself, which is what happens in the medieval period. Charlemagne's never able to go west, really. It's effectively isolated for hundreds and hundreds of years, which leads to the development of this particular, I think, proto, not only capitalism, but this very early ancient liberalism that leads to things like the Magna Carta. Because with an integrated Western Europe, a totally integrated Western Europe without that English offshore, British offshore territory, I think you get a more integrated economic space. And particularly, you also don't get a bunch of those British French wars that happened over the course of the first 1400 years AD.
You kept saying the word integrated, and I think just focusing on this early period, this early medieval period, you talked about the relationship of England to the rest of empire, but I also think just the application of a heavier application of Roman infrastructure then gives England itself, the political area of it, a more integration on itself. It's more of an identity of a thing starting from the beginning, and I feel my knowledge of early English history is it's defined by these warring factions, these small kingdoms that are all competing against each other to form a national identity. And it's kind of, there are high points of some, and then everybody gets conquered by some other person. And I think that, if there is a more established trade networks, more established centers of political power from early on, I think that also makes the entire thing more of the entirety of the English geographic area more of a centralized area that is easier to be taken over by, say, a Charlemagne, and being like, okay, there's an administrative structure here that can be conquered rather than 100 little warring chiefdoms of Ethelric's and whoever that are in charge of it in the early medieval period.
I mean, and that has knock-on effects if you think about like quote unquote Muslim Spain. If there's this integrated territory, maybe you don't have the fracturing of the Western Roman Empire in the way that it does, and then you have a totally different history of Western Europe.
I mean, you could have if you had a unified, Holy Roman Empire as it was originally conceived, which is was centered in France, not in Germany. That drift came later. That you could have like a continental orientation between like Muslim Spain and this like more unified Holy Roman Empire.
And I think this leads next, almost directly into Chris's next point. Chris, do you want to talk about it? Because I think the way you posed it is actually really interesting, given the centrality of the Viking invasions to the development of this Anglo-Saxon Norman culture that eventually gives rise to capitalism.
Yeah, so I think this next phase of history is quite interesting to consider in this context. Because again, if we're assuming that this vast geographic space is filled in, it does immediately throw all the early medieval kingdoms of Europe into total disarray. But you can plausibly still consider that an independent power base an independent Norwegian power base arises that is this Viking culture, and that it still is launching these raids onto Western Europe. Which were, very dramatic and cataclysmic for all the polities there. But if there's more space, if it's closer to Norway, if it's more spread out, if there's more geographical territory to cover, perhaps these Viking invasions are just more dispersed and less cataclysmic and less of a wholesale invasion of this island that is separated from everywhere else, that is part of this, much more recognizable North Sea kind of circle of lands that includes Norway, Denmark, and England during this time. So perhaps, the Viking era is less of a thing.
Right. The question that I think is really compelling here is, what if there's no Danelaw, really? What if you're able to come together as even if the Western Roman Empire, is no longer as connected to Rome itself, but has these sorts of large polities. You have, Western Gaul is now a unified unit. Do you actually either, if not totally fight off the Vikings because their military capacities were just like very, very effective at the time, do you have like a much lesser influence of the Danelaw, which I think is actually pretty crucial towards proto-individualism and proto-liberalism? That's sort of what makes England interesting, is you have that unique blend of the Northern European with the collapsing Western Roman.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking about this as like, if you don't have the specific place of island England to focus on, even if they're bringing these, Norse traditions over, perhaps instead of a concentrated area, you end up with just hundreds and hundreds of little settlements, little raiding villages, little trade posts scattered across this vast space in the now filled in Northern Sea. Or perhaps you don't even get that kind of, seafaring, raiding type of society, because it's just the primacy of the North Sea as a transit location is just vastly diminished by the virtue of it not being a big sea, being a big land area.
And that's also really interesting, because what then potentially happens, which we haven't talked about, is what if, let's say, you have in England the Western Roman structures, you adopt the North Sea raiding technologies, and then you get a British Empire that's not seafaring but goes east. Like it pulls almost like a Hitler or a Napoleon, where it begins to conceive of itself not as this territory that needs to get spaces, but like now you have a land-based empire emanating from the UK into Europe. That's pretty wild if you think about it.
Yeah. You have like an acceleration of that eastward push that like was characterized by the Teutonic Knights after the failure of the Crusades. So you'd have to assume, if you still have a Christian Europe, you'd still have that push east, but maybe a more concerted and effective push east than the disorganized bumblefuck that the Crusades ended up being. Because you had a bunch of these assholes all competing with one another, and they'd be in the middle of a campaign, and then they'd have to go home because the other guy quit so he could go and try to take his throne. That kind of bullshit. Like the Second Crusade was, the fourth one, the Richard the Lionhearted one, was completely undermined by the fact that he was in competition with his cousin, the King of France, and they were both supposed to be leading armies there. And then the cousin went back to France, and then the English had to go back because they thought he was going to try to take the throne. Like, if you don't have that kind of horse hockey going around, you have a more unified imperial administration, then maybe you have like an actual effective recolonization of the Middle East.
This is also making me think, as these points blend into each other, and we're talking about the competition between England and France. When you first suggested this topic, my like shoot from the hip first thought was, England just becomes France too. It's like has basically the same trajectory and political history and very similar like political evolutions. And so when you're talking about that push to the east, I'm thinking that maybe the 100 Years' War is probably not fought in France, but is fought maybe between England and France in Germany or something like that over, influence.
Or if they held it together, or against, the Saracen. Mm-hmm. It's a continual crusade on a stable and perhaps expanding border. Mm-hmm. As opposed to what it was, just the petty squabbles, or like an attempt to conquer Germany that then like breaks into factionalism.
I mean, I do love, even with this massive geographic change, the assumption can stay the same that Germany is still fucked. for 1,000 years of political
Well,
history.
that's the question, right? So this is actually a big question. So Germany, obviously, what actually happens is they break up to 1,000,000 principalities. But if you have Anglo-French power coming together, and not only that, France was never able to develop the Navy partially because they had England right there. But what if you have England-France mega power in which it develops on one hand the land-based military tactics that France specialized in, plus the seafaring tactics of England, because it's still a promontory, it's still a peninsula that is pushing out into the ocean. So Doggerland, what it allows to do, it depends. Doggerland could be one of two things. It could either be like the Reach, in Game of Thrones, where it's impossible to, cool reference, where it's impossible to be totally conquered. Or it could be like a linking space that allows two relatively different geographical areas to come together in a mega power that combines both the best of land and sea powers. So you might even get an earlier colonialism. What if you get rid of all of those British-French wars? You get an earlier colonialism, you get an earlier conquest.
Eastern focused, not to the oceans, because the technology wasn't there yet, to even conceive of going to the Americas, and the desperation didn't exist. It would have been East, and if there would have been if there would have had this sort of effective administration emerging out of this hyperpower coming into being, it absolutely would be able to effectively assert. But that basin of Germany, which could not be ever brought into a single unit, that's in the context of Europe where there can be no main power that is able to consolidate beyond a certain level, at which point it breaks up. And you get back to a inefficient level of small state conflict that won't allow anyone to take power. So in that context, Germany is and has been ungovernable until the modern era. This could have accelerated that significantly because it's not like there was any other competitor state that could have built resistance to an effective Anglo-French empire. They would just be unable to resist them because of their limited capacity.
And that's interesting because if you think about Europe in the medieval period, what's unique about it is that there's 1,000,000 polities. If you think about the Islamic world, it's these gigantic governed spaces. If you think about China, it's these gigantic governed spaces. So what if you get the European version of that? So then this is really the question, how much do you guys think capitalism is dependent on those small polities constantly fighting with each other?
I think that it's the conditions that are necessary. I think it's the fundamental social condition that brings everything else into alignment, because it is the necessity of conflict that pushes people towards adopting destabilizing technologies that are threats to established rule that they otherwise would not want to see encouraged. It's the necessity of conflict. And so the fact that everybody in Europe is always fighting their neighbor in every moment, and therefore every momentary advantage over their neighbor is to be exploited out of, again, necessity, because this is an existential question that results in innovations being adopted by these states they're small, but they're big enough to have concentrated enough capital to be able to invest in certain innovations and technologies, and then use those in a way that the empires of China did not, even though the inventions came just the same way they did and faster, in fact, earlier, they were suppressed and not adopted because there was not that existential question due to the relative stability of the imperial order, which was why the question that we're really asking is, if you don't have this little organelle popping off of the continent, England, able to exist as this synthesizing clearinghouse for all of these, all of the innovations that are occurring in the context of this endless tumult of violence, where they really are bringing up, they are the runt of the litter here. They're at the far east of the continent. They have access to basically no real resources except fucking wool, and then they have to try to survive in competition with these states that have much greater resources. And it puts them into, it orients their entire society towards this expedient acceptance of destabilizing technologies, social and otherwise, that is not in evidence in other social structures in Europe. Like Englishmen create capitalism because of the conditions of being English. And what we're saying here is, if you don't have that, if that part of the world is just integrated into this system, and therefore the conditions to create Englishmen don't exist, does that mean that we get a relatively stable, larger polity that is in imperial war at all times with, the fucking Turks and hell, probably the Mongolians at some point? They're going to have to handle with Mongolians.
Yeah, because they would take over Germany, right? What if it's an English-French power in Vienna?
Yeah, exactly. Like that violence is all happening, but like at the lower level, you're going to have more of this steady state, which means that capitalism will have a much harder time emerging in the crisis conditions that brought it into being. And the two main crises that lurch a relatively stable European feudalism in the direction of capitalism are first the Black Death, and then the Little Ice Age of the 17th century. And those things, you have at the point of the Black Death a feudalism that was in terminal stasis. It was locked because there wasn't enough gold to stimulate like virtual economic activity, and there wasn't enough land for everybody who needed to eat. It was not, and there was nowhere for it to expand because the crusade had failed, and the exogenous shock of the Black Death, the Malthusian check, reoriented the structures and destabilized feudalism critically. And from that point on, feudalism is doomed. Something has to replace it. And that doesn't come into existence, though, after the subsequent 200 years of hyper conflict that creates these new military states that are able to call to their power all of these new technologies of bureaucracy and taxation and gunpowder and firearms, and this stuff that raises the stakes of the conflict and requires some new social formation to contain conflict. And the only place that's going to be stabilized is one that is able to experience the conditions of a capitalist power, namely an imperial relationship with a subject other. And no other European polity had that experience in that post-Black Death world than England, because of their relationship to Ireland, which is wholly unique in Europe.
Before we get on,
sorry,
I feel like you want to transition right to Ireland, but I want to bring up one other small example of this European competition before we go to Ireland, because I feel like that's going to be a big topic of conversation. Another thing that this geographic what if brought up for me in this context is the eradication of the Dutch as a political entity in the way that we would know it. I mean, it's basically turns the Low Countries into a landlocked territory. And along these innovations, these technological innovations that Matt is talking about, a lot of it in England comes up in direct competition to the innovations brought about by Dutch mercantile seafaringness in this early modern period. And just that idea that there is no other, I mean, theoretically, some other political entity that would arise, maybe it's mainland England competing with, I don't know, maybe Amsterdam is now Dundee, Scotland or something, as like the mercantile capital of Northern Europe. But just as you're talking about the conditions that force Englishmen to adopt capitalism, if you don't have a power right across the channel right there that you are competing with every day for shipping lanes, for trade routes, for merchant supremacy, like it just vastly disincentivizes any kind of development there.
And then England gets to adapt all of these innovations that the Dutch pioneer, that they observe this, and then they're able to incorporate into their state that then is able to compete on equal terms with the Dutch and eventually overwhelm them because of their superior population and resources. I mean, the Dutch were punching way above their weight because of the very specific conditions that they existed under, which would not exist in this world. There would be no Dutch republic to break away from Habsburg Spain and to frantically, due to the necessity of war over the next 80 years, forge this mercantile proto-capitalist colonial machinery that becomes the structural apparatus for the imposition of capitalism on the globe.
And again,
you don't have that filled in Doggerland.
And again, this is such a wild, like, what if? Again, maybe the Dutch Republic just exists, but it's off the west coast of Denmark that is now extends a few hundred more miles into the sea or something like that. Like, obviously, perhaps these conditions arise somewhere else, but given we're just talking about how it would change our conception of European development now, I think, you can't underplay the importance of the development of the Dutch Republic as pre-England.
Yeah.
England 0, Mark 1.
Yeah,
whatever.
England Mark 1. And then they got the best deal out of anybody. The Dutch, for like, there's a premium for being first in any place, right? Like, and the Dutch have enjoyed it immensely because they were the innovators. They created the blueprint that the British eventually then took from them. In what ended up, they fought a couple of wars, but it ended up being a leveraged buyout. Mm-hmm. Like when they brought William and Mary over in 1688, that is essentially a corporate merger between the Dutch and English colonial enterprises.
So well, I have actually a couple of things. Do you think then that the Dutch, or really Northern Europe, is part of this like greater imperial polity that we're now creating in our minds?
Yeah. Oh, right. Yeah. Right. What I was saying is that they invented the thing. Then they got leverage bought out. They didn't have to be destroyed. They weren't their fields weren't salted. They didn't have their precious clocks and chocolates taken from them. They got to live at a higher standard of living, and they've been able to hold on to that ever since. And now they're able to tinker with their beautiful little clockwork society there on an imperial subsidy. And meanwhile, England, they're the ones who took it and ran with it, but they're just so fucking miserable. They're so miserable because they lost it relatively recently, and they still have the psychic scars for that. Whereas the Dutch haven't had it for hundreds of years, so they're just happy to have their narrow ass houses.
Well, this is then the question: is there a homogeneity in all these cultures that are pretty much not homogenous, partially because the Doggerland was filled in and it led to this constant conflict? So, is there are there, in the era of nation states, is there just one gigantic mega Western European state?
Well, that's the thing is, I think basically what we're asking is, could you have a reestablishment of a imperial social formation in Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire? And in the real world, I think that conclusively, no. Given our geography, given the layout of things, there can be no way for a central power to reassert itself onto the European continent after the fall of Rome. But again, we're assuming, what if you don't have that England down there? What if you don't have this Low Countries, this specific nexus of broken down authority that can be reconstituted by with this relationship, this sort of osmotic relationship with the rest of Europe, where it's able to stabilize and innovate around the conflict that defines the rest of the continent. Without that, maybe you could reimpose central imperial authority. And what that means is you have the continuation of the cycle of boom and bust rather than the sort of broken, straightforward line, what do they call it? The great divergence, right? That in the from the 16th to the 19th century sees Europe just essentially escape gravity with its technological and cultural innovations. And if we don't have that divergence, then we would still be, I guess, not in feudalism, because by the 17th century it's in crisis just naturally. But it would have to be something dramatically different, and I think it would mean that we would be at a dramatically later earlier stage of technological development right now in that world.
Well, then this is the Ireland question, because there is still a UK in the sense that there is an island looking at Europe, and it's Ireland. Does that matter? Do we get a form of Irish capitalism? And if we don't, why do you guys think that wouldn't have happened there?
I'd say it's just Ireland is just too small. We're talking about the Goldilocks zone, right? And England is a small island relatively, to Madagascar or whatever, but it's also densely populated and has a lot of fertile land on it, and Ireland is a fraction of its size and population, and I don't think it would be able to support the level of social production necessary to really get behind innovations. And also, as I said, it would not be able to have an imperial relationship. What, with itself? I think it would be more. I think it would more likely be Ireland would be sort of like an Iceland, or like Sardinia or something. Just like an island that is a stable thrall to one of probably the Anglo-French Empire there, because one of the things that makes capitalism happen is it's not just Britain being this backwater with nothing but a bunch of wool and a need to compete. They also have this place where they can experiment with ways of seeing, to get academic with it, ways of viewing questions of efficiency and human like new values, like replacing like the stable rhythmic agricultural values that had like defined feudal society with abstract values around,
which is the Scottish
around
Enlightenment,
production, which are capable when you're not dealing with your people in the existential sense, when you're dealing with free real estate and the free labor of subjects, and that those structures of legal thought and of theology and just the techniques of improving agricultural yield are all pioneered in Ireland.
So, I mean, when you say about that Goldilocks zone, really what you're saying is the one of the main things about England is that it is a small island off of a competitive continent with a small island off of it. So
yes.
Really, for Ireland to become the England, it would have to have an Ireland off of it.
Exactly. But I don't think necessarily that you wouldn't eventually see capitalism emerge just out of, some sort of response to a crisis that we couldn't even anticipate, because that's the thing that knocks like Europe in that direction, are these exogenous shocks. And so we have to assume that those will continue to accumulate, because there's still contradictions in this, cod feudalism that they have, this mercantile proto-capitalism that they get to before England takes off.
But I think the difference is the exogenous shocks come within the context of constant competition. The exogenous shocks come within a world when if you like literally curve the wall of your castle, now you're able to conquer new nation states. And so the difference here is that we might get capitalism, let's say in the year 3000, with the fighting between the various land-based empires that now dominate Europe. And that is just so different that we can't even predict what it was.
Yeah.
Also related to colonization. So absent these forms of constant competition, which engender competition for seacraft vessels to search for literal capital, what happens to the Western Hemisphere? Is that just left totally untouched?
I think it would be a lot longer before there was any contact. And that raises a very interesting question, because if contact is like sporadic and not organized around, like joint stock companies and colonies and these projects, if it's just people getting blown off course or small raiding parties or things like that, then do you have a situation where the Amerindians encounter European diseases and then are able to adapt to them? Have a bunch of people, of course, die, because that's going to happen. It happened in Europe, but not in a context where everyone is dying as Europe is colonizing the continent, but rather, Europe is still basically doing their own thing, probably concentrating on their eastern frontiers, so that eventually there would be extended contact between these two groups, but it would be in one where there is no more biological advantage to the Europeans. And if that's the case, then I don't think you can have European conquest of the Americas.
Which we'll talk about in a future episode, everyone. Yeah. Matt just gave us a preview.
Well, I have to ask to clarify, because, obviously this scrambles the map of the entirety of European history, but the initial phases of exploration were very much a Southern European project. Spain, Portugal leading the way, and of course it's Spain that makes first contact with the New World. So, I mean, do you see the destabilizing of Northern Europe to be so significant in this history that Spain is not and Portugal are still not competing to unlock new areas of the map on the African coast, and then eventually seeing what's out there further to the west in the ocean?
All of those projects were motivated by in a macro sense. Those were all of those trips to the west, all those trips across to the scary edge of the world were inevitable as soon as the Ottomans take Constantinople, because it was a move out of necessity to compensate for closure of trade routes to the east.
Right.
And what I'm assuming in this world is a constant is that you have a sustainable eastward project that can orient European politics, and in a way that was denied them by the relative weakness of Europe vis-a-vis the rising power of the Turks. And I feel like if you don't have that, if you have a actual colonial domination of Near East and Central Europe and land connections to trade routes, I don't know if there's the incentive to put that much into westward, very risky westward expansion or exploration.
Definitely get what you're saying. I think that it might scramble the timeline a little bit, but I have to imagine even if there is
eventually it's going to happen.
Yeah.
That's the thing. Eventually all of this is going to happen because of the fact that it's cyclical, but it's also accumulative.
Right.
Technology is accumulative, and that means that it changes the relationship between people and their environment in a way that they don't understand and anticipate at the time. And that leads them to break up without even knowing it, the world they live in, and building one without knowing what it is. And that was capitalism in this world, but it would have to be something no matter what, because the crisis continued to accumulate at the center of a class society.
But this, I think, leads us to an interesting question about the mind worlds of these people, because I would say it's pretty clear you're not going to get a Scottish Enlightenment, which is effectively the early liberalism providing the ideological sheen of capitalism. But what happens to the Catholic Church in this world? That's really interesting. Do you even get a Protestant Reformation? Or is this sort of land-based imperial space, it kind of just allows the Catholic Church to continue indefinitely, particularly when you're facing Mongol society to the east and an Islamic society to the south?
Yep.
What happens to the church? So do you not get the technology of Protestantism, which is so crucial, I think, to capitalism's dominating Europe and eventually the world?
No, I think you have a holy and unified Christendom, because it was the growing pains of Europe that brought Protestant into existence. But those growing pains were accelerated by all of these, urbanizing trends that were caused by this small state competitive framework that we're assuming out of existence. So, I think you have, there's obviously you'll never have a stability. There was always going to be cyclical outbreaks of resistance to the church, heresies and whatnot, but I don't think that they get locked into local and then national networks of state support. So I think you keep the church stays in control of the whole continent there.
Yeah, and I mean, as we will get into in Matt and I's future situation, it is no coincidence that Protestantism breaks out in the most disunified area of the empire. And if I don't know if I'm totally convinced with what we seem to take in as the given that this leads to a more inevitably to a more unified Europe. I mean, I'm 50-50 because when you look at the two major pulses of the center mass of Europe, you either get a France where things get unified more quickly, or a Germany where everything continues to fall apart. And again, the conditions I think are so hard to know given this big of a what if that perhaps Northern England or all of Northern Europe falls into a Holy Roman Empire trap, and it is a disunified mass. And in that case, I think that you could maybe see Protestantism breaking out in Scotland, for example. But, I agree with Matt. If you take the premise that things are going to be more unified and there is a more singular Christendom because of this change, I think that innovation, that the particular mind virus hypothesis comes much later in a different place, if at all.
I would predict, I agree, yeah, it would come later. And I don't know exactly when, obviously, but I would say if you had to make a guess where, I would say Switzerland, because of the mountains, baby. Religious descent is always more secure at elevation. I think that's where it would pop up.
Well, and the question, though, because I tend to lean toward the unification, because where you have so much exchange between Britain and France over the course of that entire late medieval period, what if you basically don't have France as a place to escape to for all of these leaders who then escape there and then reconvene and then reconquer England, and then they have parts of Normandy, and then they don't have parts of Normandy, because that gets rid of all of that competition, which I think is the more micro-regional context for the development of proto-capitalism in the UK, and really proto-liberalism in the sense of focusing on the individual. So what if you don't get that sort of the inventing of the individual argument for Europe, and Europe becomes a more socially organized space in the mind worlds of the people living there?
I mean, does Europe end up looking more like Chinese history?
Right, which is, you get an incredibly different culture. So you get basically the argument being that, like, the Saint Paul develops the idea of the individual, and then it really takes off over the next 1,000 years in Northern Africa and Europe. But what if that entire European part of the equation is thrown out? Do you get socialism in 13th century Western Europe?
Not obviously advanced socialism as we would understand it, as a horizon, to transcend class politics, or to transcend class rule, but like as a sort of like a peasant equilibrium, perhaps.
The commons,
then you don't get technologically advanced like society. You don't have all the things that we embed in our assumptions of our social goods, because they define our society. And that's the thing. You cannot have socialism without capitalism first. And so whatever would emerge in this world that we're creating, it would have to be some sort of, if it was going to be socialism, it would have to be socialism at a very low level of social technological development, because, it would have been perhaps the collective will of people to be like, let's not go down that road. Let's not do that. Let's all choose as we can to do that. And then they could make the choice, which would have been a rational choice if it could have been agreed to and understood as such, to not open that particular box. But we didn't get those conditions. So that means we instead unopened the box, which created the modern alienated capitalist subject, who can only be redeemed by participation in socialist class struggle. It's the final secular continuation of Protestantism. So in a sense, you're supposed to say, well, thank God we had Doggerland, because it gave us a chance to develop a socialist project. But now we stand at the precipice of the missed chance of socialism. And this is why we sit here and we ponder, like, well, maybe it would be better off if we were all, like in some sort of rural commune, but not like hippies trying to escape who they are, but like in a
organic way,
in a rooted, social sense. I think a lot of people are fantasizing about that one way or the other on different parts of the political spectrum. But, what would you need to do to live that way? You would need to literally live in a world where there was no England, where the Doggerland never filled in. That's the only world where that is possible. So turning that into a political project it's a fantasy.
But what if you get here's a potential hinge point. What if you get capitalism with Ottoman characteristics?
Ooh.
Like, what if the Ottomans, who are in a more central, like sort of middle space, literally, where they have to defend various peripheries, and for example, that's why they developed a lot of these military technologies. What if they're able to actually successfully invade Central Europe, which seems more likely in a world without an independent England?
It's also, again, there's so many ways you could take this. It's also like, okay, if we're imagining a more unified Europe without so much, interstate conflict as it progresses, they're theoretically not developing as sophisticated means of warfare throughout this entire time, which means that a more expansive project like the Ottomans might be able to simply roll over them and
take over the world.
Yeah,
I mean, literally take over.
You're looking
all
at
of the world.
Ottoman Frankfurt or whatever,
Right, because like the key, at least in 20th century geopolitics, is you can't let anyone control the Eurasian ecumene. And no one was ever able to control the western portion of that ecumene because of the incredible number of polities in Europe, and hence the violence in the developing military technologies over the course of the late medieval and early modern period. But if you get rid of that, and what if you get like a literally ecumenical empire? That's maybe we don't get a Marx because the history is so different with Doggerland, that you're able to pass over the violence of capitalism because you have just this gigantic pseudo world empire. I mean, obviously you would come into contact with the Chinese on its eastern borders, but imagine if you have an ecumenical space totally unified.
I mean, again, I'm kind of thinking that this is even more. I think that there's other ways that you could think that this wouldn't even be that revolutionary, because I'm even thinking about like, the Muslim invasion of Spain was able to eventually be fought off and rolled back. And again, that Spain is developing capacity just through its own internal conflicts, internal Christian conflicts with Spain, or with France, which is its only direct neighbor. I mean, I'm thinking of like the small regions in which things would continually develop roughly the same, and thinking about what that would mean for a connected UK. I mean, I think that it is certainly possible that a single united Christendom develops, and through the lack of conflict is weakened through it. But there are still these very strong political political entities that developed just through their own internal conflict. And again, the relatively isolated Iberian Peninsula, I mean, it's just got the one border with France, and it was able to develop enough to push out its Muslim occupiers. I mean, does that make sense to you guys?
Yeah, it does. And that also, like, what if relatedly you don't get or relatedly you do get the development of the Italian city-state system, which is
I was also
crucial.
thinking, just in the back of my head, it's like if France and if there's all this land up here, perhaps the Normans don't go south, and perhaps Sicily and Naples are forever connected with Italy. Perhaps Italian unification happens hundreds of years earlier as a singular kingdom, which is, again, I guess that points towards the development of a more unification rather than less unification, if there is more land to offset any kind of pressures and conflicts.
And to some degree, that depends on what Doggerland would be. If it's swampy, marshy territory, then you still have England. Mm-hmm. But if it's territory that's easily crossable by horses, then I think you have an entirely different space. And maybe it's still difficult to cross the Pyrenees, but it's possible. It's certainly not impossible. And you could even imagine a flanking procedure from the south, where you go through the Straits of Gibraltar, and you just go up through there, through your, Brito-Franco super empire that now controls Germany into the Eastern Prussian fields. And that to me, I really do think that there would have been more unification. And I really do think that it would have tamped down competition in Europe, which just really, in my mind, provides a space for the Ottomans to just come in the 1500s and just take shit over.
Okay, so best case scenario, we have the imposition of Islamic rule over Europe.
Right, which is you're always saying, Matt. That's the way forward.
Universal enlightenment coming in the form of a Muslim holy war that sweeps the globe and brings about the return of the Mahdi.
Do you get colonialism in that world? Or do you just go to the moon? Like, you develop space technology in 1750.
Well, again, it's all about what are the conditions under which the Americans, broadly considered, encounter the European disease matrix. The diseases of demographically dense societies. Like, if they encounter them over time, and not in the context of a direct confrontation, I think that you don't have your colonialism because it can't be sustained. It cannot be it cannot be dug deeply enough into the earth to make it worth the effort, which is not true in our world because there was the entire hundreds of miles with inland of everywhere that the Europeans touched. They were essentially uncontested for land because of the massive toll taken in the populations of the people who encountered those diseases. If that doesn't happen, then I don't think you have colonialism. Which means, we either destroy ourselves in a world war somehow, or we get it together to create world government and go to the moon. Those are the two options. Those are always the ones that are on the table.
And that's what's also really implied in all this is you basically don't get the nation state as a political form,
right? Which
is
an imposition of like this right. particular European phenomenon.
Right. And I think the nation state is a major cause of humanity's misery. So removing that entire political form, I think, does augur a more progressive world, however you want to define that.
Yeah. No, nationalism has been the chief psychic technology of of reaction and of defeating of socialism at every turn.
And that's the irony of actually existing history, is that you need that conflict to develop the capitalism, to develop the technologies necessary to actually create socialism. But concomitantly, you get the development of a nationalism that prevents the working class from becoming the subject object of history.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is the impasse we are at today.
Yeah. So the answer, how do we fix that? Somebody get a time machine and a bunch of bulldozers and just dam it up, like just
build a levee. Well, I mean, that's a funny thing when we were like starting with the premise of this. Obviously, the natural premise is that this geographic formation existed once and wonder if it persisted. But the other funny thing is England's right there. You can see it from France. Like if there was just a bridge, like literally like a causeway that you could get people across like permanently. If there was 500 feet of solid ground, but at Dover, everything would be so radically changed along these axes. And that's why I think it's this fun to think about because, that's the thing about England. So close, but so far.
Yeah.
And it really is one of the biggest mechanisms, the drivers of all of world history.
It's ridiculous.
They get that little moat.
Ugh.
And what's interesting to me about this one in particular is that it really does highlight the centrality of geography, the ultimate material to world history, which is something that's not an especially popular topic of conversation, but for most of human, strategic thinking was absolutely crucial. So this is probably the most macro one that we're going to do this season. We've got a bunch of really fun episodes coming up, dealing with Napoleon, dealing with Martin Luther, dealing with the topic Matt discussed about what if there were encounters between the Western Hemisphere and Europe much earlier than they actually occurred.
I feel like you guys should do that one next because I feel like it really flows directly from this. If we just sent over a few trade boats, if Europe had just sent over a few trade boats, seen what was up, and then we're like, we'll get to you guys later, and gave the New World 100 years or so to cook with cooking up antibodies. Wildly different future.
Yeah,
enormously different. And then again, organized around that central question of colonialism is foundational, to say the least, to capitalism. So what if you have a non-extractive relationship there, or non-extractive in quite the same way? I think it opens up entire new spaces to think through what could have been. All right. On that cough, everyone, thank you for listening to Hinge Points. We look forward to seeing you all next week. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.
In a world where points depend on hinges,
there are hinge points inside us all.
History on a Segway.
It's overdetermined.
We are the points that our hinges have been seeking.
what this podcast asks is, what if?
Agriculture. Fail or epic win?
What if it was Johnny Mango Pit?
What if the Ottomans had AK-47?
Maybe climate change was a good idea.
What if the Ottomans had lightsabers?
What if the buffalo killed us?
What if Santa Claus was real, like an actual guy who gave presents every year? This is Hinge Points.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Hinge Points. I'm Danny Bessner, normally of American Prestige, but I am here with my buddy Matt Christman to go through the big hinge points in history, to think through alternative histories of what might have been. And today might be one of the bigger ones that we've done. We did Doggerland for our first episode this season, which is a pretty big one, but this one might be even bigger. It's a little more recent, but it's equally massive in its potential implications. And what if the colonial encounter between European peoples and native peoples in the Western Hemisphere went a little bit differently? And today, Matt and I would like to welcome to the podcast Alexander Aviña. Alex is an associate professor of Latin American history at Arizona State University, and he's also the author of Specters of Revolution, Peasant Guerrillas in the Cold War Mexican Countryside. Alex, why don't you actually start with just setting the scene about the role that disease played in shaping the colonial encounter when it first happened in the late 15th, early 16th centuries?
Yeah, sure, Danny. Thanks for having me on. I think so. The broader time frame that we're looking at is 1490s up until, let's say, like 1600, right? That's the first long encounter, the first long century of the colonial encounter in the Americas. And, depending on region and whether you're talking about modern day Mexico or the entire region, we tend to think about like an 80 to 90% depopulation, right, of the region due to diseases. I think there's also a danger to make this an inevitable thing. I think some of the historiography has really worked against the idea that it's disease that accomplished this massive depopulation and death, right? I think it's a combination of famine, of war, of disunity that really went into this just horrific loss of life in the Americas as a result of the colonial encounter. So starting with Christopher Columbus's voyages that set the scene of colonialism in the Caribbean of the late early 1500s. To really, I think by the time we get to 1600, there is a more or less Spanish and even Portuguese presence throughout most of the Americas. The disease really had a huge impact, the most impact, when the Spanish were fighting against highly centralized, powerful Amerindian civilizations, right? So the more centralized, the more populated, the more hierarchical the indigenous civilization, the better chance that the Spanish had in defeating them, not primarily because of disease, but really because they were able to forge these really important alliances with other indigenous groups who hated the Mexica in Mexico or the Aztecs, or had a lot of beef with the Incas in South America, right? So the way that the historiography has gone recently, the emphasis has been placed more on that in terms of setting the scene for then what the introduction of diseases like smallpox, bubonic plague, and others will accomplish in leading these massive depopulation rates and death of 80 to 90% of the region.
And so what we're going to think through on this episode is what if that 85 to 90% didn't happen? And we could think through if maybe things stay the same. Maybe they still make the same alliances, maybe they don't, or maybe it's a totally different world. So Matt, why don't you talk about the alternative history world that we're thinking through, which is pretty interesting based on recent research about encounters between the North Atlantic world and the Western Hemisphere well before the age of formal colonialism.
So the idea here is, instead of American populations encountering European diseases and European colonial ventures at the same time, which is what we got, a situation where the colonists were able to exploit this, incredible social dislocation caused by this huge shock to the population and to social structures, and they were able to establish beachheads due to that. What if instead earlier more regular but still randomized, basically, encounters between Europeans and Native Americans led to the same eventual catastrophe. That's an inevitability that the new, quote unquote, new world will come in contact with old world disease structures. And the alternative here is if that happens earlier, as a result of more randomized contact, not these state projects, then perhaps by the time Europe turns to the West to begin the process of building the colonial world, that they are encountering native societies that were able to recover and restructure themselves in the aftermath of a massive pandemic, much the same way the Europeans were able to do after the Black Death. And then the encounter occurs on those relatively equal terms. And then the question becomes what would emerge from that kind of encounter.
And so, Alex, it's interesting because based on recent historiography, the disease effects, correct me if I'm wrong, come a little bit later than the initial encounter. That's correct, right? So this sets the stage. Do things proceed relatively similarly at the very beginning? So what do you think? So Cortez arrives, whatever, and then they get going, as it were, and there's not this initial wipeout, this initial eradication of this biological, basically genocide of the peoples. Are things relatively the same? What do you think?
I think things play out really differently, right? Especially if we think about the Caribbean, because the Caribbean becomes a beachhead, as Matt was kind of alluding to earlier, right? It's like these loser Spaniards who are not like an official army, right? Like they're like the second sons. They're like the sons who are unloved in their families and they're not going to get land and all that shit. They're the ones who make up some of these early groups that will reach the Caribbean. If their inability to establish colonialism and colonial rule on the Caribbean, if that doesn't happen because they're unable to militarily or biologically defeat the indigenous peoples, then I think it's game over. Like there's that prevents the eventual spread to mainland Mexico and eventually into South America as well. If the Taino and the Taino peoples are able to resist that initial Spanish incursion after the second or third of Columbus's voyages, then that really, like, the Mexica are going to be good. And actually, the one cool thing that I thought about a possibility is that there was one of the greatest historians of Mexico that was based in the U.S., Friedrich Katz. Like one of his early, where he started as a colonialist, or he had work on colonial Mexico, and he had this thesis from like the 60s or 70s. They talked about the Mexica Empire already being riven internally by class conflict. So if there's no Cortez that ever comes because they're not able to take over in the Caribbean, then this idea of a Macehual or a commoner like revolution or revolt from below to bring down the mighty Mexica Empire, like that's something pretty cool to think about, I think.
So you could get socialism in the quote unquote new world in the 1500s, basically. So then you have, over the course of the development of the 15th century, a Spanish imperialism that effectively fails in the Caribbean because people are able to prevent the establishment of a beachhead, which would then lead to the invasion and eventual conquest of Mexico. At the same time, you get an internal class revolt. So is it fair to call the Mexica Empire a class society? Like, how does that work?
It is a class society, right? You do have, the vast majority of Mexica who live in the capital of Mexico, Tenochtitlan, like they never lay their eyes on the Tlatoani, the emperor. Like no one sees this guy except for the highest nobility and the highest priest, right? Because he's like a mouthpiece for the gods. So there's a definite class structure. And one way that you achieve a little bit of class mobility is through warfare, right? For men, at least, right? To achieve class mobility through your feats in battle. So there is a stratified hierarchical class structure that exists within the center of the Mexica Empire. And when we talk about the Mexica Empire, it's kind of weird because it's a different type of empire, I guess. But another thing that's important about the Caribbean too is that if you're unable to establish a beachhead and indigenous people survive, then you also don't have the introduction of African slaves, right? Because the first thing that they want in the Caribbean is gold. Gold gets exhausted relatively quickly. So the Spaniards start to organize encomiendas, which are the control over indigenous labor and tribute. And when they start to die as a result of warfare, famine, and also disease, that's when the idea comes in of, okay, well, we're going to bring in African slaves to work on these newly formed sugar plantations that had already started to be formed off the west coast of Africa and some of the Atlantic islands. So this also will impact Africa, and it would impact Africa in a major way. It would, and if you don't have the slave trade, then if we get all Eric Williams on this, then you're not going to have the development of a particular form of industrial capitalism that Britain will later develop, in large part based on their wealth that they're generating in their plantations in the Caribbean.
So Matt, let's go to Europe. What do you think happens? That beachhead is never established. Europe doesn't have the colonial encounter in quite the same way. What happens to British industrial capitalism, Western European capitalism? It's such a wild.
We see that
change.
like on the verge of the conquest of the Americas, you have this feudal system in crisis, in like a terminal secular crisis. And unable to deal with its mounting contradictions and the ratcheting up conflict between the states of Europe that encouraged. And it was the creation of a colonial realm that sort of stabilized that structure and allowed for the accumulation, the first primitive accumulation in the colonies, and then the circulation within Europe of like a real cash economy, a genuine, like a continent-wide circulation of currency that then allows for something to grow out of this broken feudal structure, which by the 17th century and the crisis thereof becomes absolutely unmanageable. And I have to imagine that absent that variable, that much like we would imagine it would occur with the Native American societies, the class conflict within the states would lead to some sort of conflict within Europe over control of like actual control of the economy. And yeah, perhaps you get sort of instead of capitalism, you get like a primitive socialism dominating both continents because of the lack of that cathartic valve to discharge and then allow for the synthesizing of class conflict.
So let's say by the year 1700, you have socialism in contemporary Mexico. Would that also be, Alex, would that also be in Peru with the Incas? Like, what are we talking now? So you get the class revolution in what is now Mexico City. You get the creation of a socialist utopia. Is that a feudal agricultural society? What are we imagining here? What was Katz imagining when he makes that argument in the 60s?
Yeah, he doesn't really explore the ramifications of his argument, but I think we can get all Mariátegui on this and think about Inca socialism, right? There were two different types of empires, right? There's a reason why after the Spanish conquered the Inca Empire, there was always this recurring myth of like the Inca will return to liberate us, right? Because that reflected a reciprocal relationship that they had with their subjects, whereas no one in Mexico ever wanted the Mexica to come back. Like once they were gone, like, get the hell out. We don't want, because they were pretty, for a variety of reasons, they could be pretty brutal, right? So yeah, it would probably be agriculturally based, right? It would be, I'm trying to think how it would be. It was someone like Mariátegui who writes about Inca socialism and the possibility of an embryonic socialism already existing within Inca society. It would be agricultural, right? It would be, the way he saw it, almost be like a radical agrarian reform of the type that we see in the 20th century in Latin America, but way more radical, where the power is actually invested in these local ayllus in Peru, or I can't remember what they're called in Mexica society, but basically these basic social units at the very bottom that will then be free from any sort of hierarchical stratified structure, and they're able to control the surplus of their labor, right? So that's what it could look like, but they're still going to. But at the same time, if there's no Spanish presence, right? Like, I also think that these empires become even more powerful, right? So that novel that I told you about, Danny, the Civilizations by Laurent Binet, like, who imagines this? He has it in the novel that the Incas go and invade Spain. They take over Spain, and they're seen as like benevolent rulers. And then, unfortunately for the French, they get invaded by the Mexica, and they get wiped out in the most brutal fashion. Which is, it's a funny, enjoyable novel.
Well, is something like that possible? I mean, because the argument for European capitalism is one of the reasons that you get these technological developments is Europe is like this hyper-competitive small polity space where people are effectively in a technological arms race. So how would technological development proceed in a society where you get a class revolution in 1540 to overthrow the Mexica and you get this new social unit-based agricultural society? How would technology work there? And I want to go to Matt in a second because it's interesting. Because you will have these two parallel developments, and then somewhere in our third experiment, we'll see like when do they encounter, and then what happens from there.
In terms of the technology, I mean, this would get us into like China too, and the great divergence debates, but and the advantage that like Britain had with coal supplies and all that shit. But no, the technology that the Spanish are using is like technology that they stole from like Jewish cartographers and the Muslims that controlled Al-Andalus for like centuries, right? And that's what gives them the navigational skills, the cartographical skills, that the sailing skills, the agricultural skills as well, right? Irrigation and stuff that they will then take over to the Americas. But if the Spanish, particularly the Spanish, if they don't manage to establish a beachhead in colonialism in the Caribbean that then spreads, then it'd be interesting to think about that actually in real history, that actually entrenches feudal structure in Spain, right? There's actually early revolts in 1500 Spain of the comuneros that are like urban and almost quasi-bourgeois. So colonialism for Spain actually entrenches like a lot of these feudalistic structures, which is why the joke in Latin America becomes, we got colonized by a colonized European power, right? Because all the riches that Spain gets will immediately go out of Spain and goes to China and goes to Amsterdam and goes to London. So you have this weird dynamic that the success of Spanish colonialism in the Americas entrenches feudalism in Spain, which then sets them back vis-a-vis other rising European powers like the British and the Dutch.
So Matt, let's go to Europe. What's happening in Britain? Is Britain doing a colonialism of Ireland? Is without having the specie and the capital that is extracted from the quote unquote new world? How are European powers reacting to the constant Sturm und Drang of conflict, the constant fighting? What are they going to do with these new social pressures?
I mean, without that valve, without that orientation of action, then you can only have war against each other, an escalation of the already endemic warfare that characterized this period. Now, the interesting thing, though, is that the technological arms race that was sparked by this early modern conflict, the gunpowder weapons and new technologies of fortification and all this stuff, those were only really viable in a context where the access to a circulatable species has exploded, because that was the chief sort of governor of European economic growth in the feudal era, was that it was tied to a relatively small amount of gold and silver, which was the only thing that could be, cross borders agreed to as a store of value. And they were basically out of gold on the eve of the Black Death. And of course, that bought time once, 60%, 50% of your population dies. But that problem had not really been solved until the dual advancements of a new technologies in mining, making it more efficient to mine in Europe, and the new access to new world supplies of silver and gold. And those that gold formed the blood, basically, in the circulatory system of this new capitalist machinery. So absent that, you have I think, more warfare, but at a lower technological level, which makes me think that if there is some socialism that could emerge out of these cycles of escalating violence, it would have to be one resting on a much lower base of economic complexity. And that in any world that we're describing, we would probably be at a completely different orientation towards technology and the world than the one we have now, one that would be difficult to even conceive of, honestly.
And another thing that I think you have, if that beachhead is never established, and that's a really useful way to think about it, is that you don't have that escape valve for literal people in Europe.
Yeah.
Like literal people are going west constantly.
And not just any people either. Your most energetic, for whatever reason, the people amongst you who have the most fire burning within them, the ones who are most effective at accomplishing a task because of their deep well of self-motivation, one way or the other, they're fleeing debts and dishonor, or they're seeking glory. One way or another, they are consumed by an idea that would let them take such an incredible risk. They're driven either by desperation or mad confidence that, if that was kept in the countries that were totally stifling socially and allowed for no upward advancement and no political subjectivity, then that is going to destroy from within your society. But instead, you get to increase the resources of your state by putting them to work on other lands against other people. It's perfect.
And this is an interesting question, and I'll throw it back to Alex now. So I don't think you get the British investments in colonialism if the Spanish don't establish the beachhead, because I think that does provide a proof of concept to, like Elizabeth and people along those lines. But does that mean that the British never engaged in the colonial encounter? Because I think that the history of the Americas, Central and South America, is different than the British history and what becomes British North America. So do the British establish a beachhead now in North America without the Spanish in the South, or how do you think that would proceed?
Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, I think, one of the reasons why the Spanish even attack England, right, toward the end of the 1500s is because there was part of the Counter-Reformation, right? And they're emboldened by the wealth and the riches that they're coming out with. So absent that, yeah, it'd be interesting to see what step forward British colonialism would have taken beyond Ireland, right? Because they've been in Ireland by the 1500s, they've been there for a couple centuries. Yeah, I don't know. It's a really interesting question. Because it is, as you're saying, Danny, it's the allure of like the Spanish finding like a literal mountain of silver in Potosí that's like really alluring to other European empires. The wealth that they extract from Potosí in South America, and then these different silver mines that they discover in Mexico, and the wealth that they're extracting from sugar plantations, that's alluring for these other rival European empires, who will then go into the Americas and start to nitpick at the edges or the fringes of what the Spanish say. This is our land. So there's a reason why the British will start to try to, pick away at the edges of Spanish empires, because they're seeing the wealth that these Spaniards have managed to extract from the Americas. But because in the late 1500s and early 1600s, the balance of power is still mostly on the Spanish, they're going at the fringes. They're going at Caribbean islands that are not inhabited. They're claimed by Spain, but they're not inhabited by Spanish. They haven't been set up as colonial outposts. And that's one of the reasons why you get them in North America, even though there's going to be a lot of conflict for the next 200-300 years in these borderland regions that are now like, South Carolina, Georgia, and then Florida. But without what the Spanish are able to do, I wonder if the English are able to project outward. And as Matt was saying, right, then they go inward and it creates all sorts of be really interesting forms of class conflict to see how they play out.
I mean, even with the degree of colonial enterprise that they did have, which as we now know, ended up covering the entire continent, that still wasn't enough to prevent a civil war that got the king's head cut off. I mean, that's how much class and social conflict was germinating in England at that time. So we're imagining a world where, I think you might still see some attempts at religious colonization of North America, but much less, much more at the sufferance of the local population as opposed to being sort of imposed upon them. And so that means it would have to be smaller. That means many more of those frantic Puritans would have to stay home. And I honestly think if that happens, maybe you don't get a restoration after the death of Cromwell. Maybe you get the furtherance and continuation to completion of like a bourgeois revolution because of the non-existence of that pressure release. Because as it stands, like during Cromwell's interregnum, that's when they're building colonial North America. And that becomes a project of the people who, might have supported him and supported the continuation of a commonwealth, or more importantly, the furtherance of the concept of a commonwealth is in attacking the remnants of feudal landed power. But what they didn't have the capacity to challenge that because their energy had partly been exsanguinated by the colonial project. Yeah,
absent war, famine, and disease, there's the English would have failed in North America, just as Spanish in our hypothetical history. Like they would have failed similarly like the Spanish in the Caribbean, right? They're not allowed to set up shop.
No way.
Or the other thing to think about, and just because I watched this recently, or our predator overlords just come in and just end everything, right? Like that's the other cool. If you watch the 2000 movie Predator versus Alien, that has another. Apparently, the Mexica were worshiping the predator. So,
oh yeah, I remember that.
That adds like another layer to this story.
Yeah, the predator. They created civilization so that we could incubate aliens for them to hunt.
Yeah, to hunt. We don't know why they hunt, but they hunt.
They love it. They can't stop doing it.
So let's say now what happens is there's a socialist revolution or a proto-socialist revolution in what is now contemporary Mexico. Does that become an empire, Alex, or does that stay relatively stable in and around what is now Mexico City? Does that expand? Do they wind up incorporating all of the various tribes and polities around the region?
So like during the rise, so the Mexica were like late newcomers to that area that is now known the Valley of Mexico, right? So this valley that's thousands of feet up in the air, and there used to be massive lakes, right? They were mostly independent city-states organized along these different shores, right? And what becomes Tenochtitlan, Mexico Tenochtitlan, is just one of these city-states. So I wonder, if there is some sort of revolution from below that overthrows the Mexica Empire from within, then I would think there's just some sort of reversion back to these independent autonomous city-states. And I wonder if it goes back to this like Game of Thrones type competition to see which city-state will emerge as the most powerful one. I mean, obviously the dynamic that would potentially change all of this is in the course of uprising, this Masewal or this lower class movement would have some sort of consciousness that would not necessarily be interested in reverting back to a system that is still highly dependent on their tribute and their agricultural labor. And in some cases, their actual blood and hearts, right? Because that's one of the reasons why the Mexica were not particularly well liked by some of their neighbors, because they required warrior hearts and blood as sacrifice to prevent the world from ending, to appease the Huitzilopochtli, their one of their main deities. So I think what you get, ideally, what would be really cool to see these city-states revert back and to turn into something that does have a presence in Mexican history, and that's the communes. And they would be these city-states would be reorganized as communes based on Masewal power and with a more egalitarian redistribution of surplus and labor, in contrast to the hierarchical relationship that existed during the city-state era and then definitely during the Mexica era.
So let's say by 1800, there's a series of a loose empire of communes in what is now Mexico. What do you think happens in British North America, or what did not become British North America? Is that just, do you get like the Iroquois Confederacy expand? What do you think happens there? Because I want to set the scene, because then we'll play it out what happens.
Yeah, I mean, so I know it was a controversial book, but like the book Comanche Empire, like the Comanche, I don't like the framing of it as an empire, but this powerful entity does not arise without horses to a certain extent, right? And to some other, and to like gun technology. So without that, then I wonder whether you have different confederations set up, and you don't necessarily have an entity this big, right? Because if you look at the outline of the region that the Comanches controlled well into the 1850s and 60s, I don't know. I mean, there's also, you had cultural exchanges that cross, hundreds and thousands of miles that we still know little about, and more work is being done. There was trade that linked groups in Florida to groups in Michigan, indigenous groups in Michigan, prior to a European arrival. So I would think that those type of trade or commercial relationships would continue to exist. And you have different confederations, different city-states, different polities existing on what later becomes British North America, absent the arrival of British colonialism.
Okay, so we have an empire of communes in Central America, maybe it even extends south, and we have more dispersed power bases in what is now North America. Matt, where are the British in 1800? Where are the French? Do you even get an enlightenment without colonialism, right? The colonialism was so crucial to the Enlightenment.
No, well, that's the whole thing, is that all the stuff that we are trying as people who imagine they are inheriting a socialist tradition, which is embedded within the capitalist revolution in Europe. The things that we seek to extend are all creations of this specific relationship to production. And if we don't get that, if we get something that is egalitarian, that avoids internal domination and also external war and repression, and that seeks to distribute from each to each, you are just not going to have the economic development that you otherwise would with a system that allows for mass despoliation and accumulation of capital, which is a necessary precondition for capitalism's emergence. So to my mind, the interesting question is, if we assume this new sort of interruption of class conflict and but a remaining conflict with nature, as these societies try to get some equilibrium with their environment. At the same time this would be happening, we still have two huge social formations that are hierarchical and that are accumulating capital and learning how to use it. And that is the Chinese and the Ottomans. And I think the question is, with less resistance to be able to be put up to them as they sort of find their extents, does this mean that that you get an inevitable Arab or Chinese conquest of Europe and North America?
So let's assume that does happen, that the Ottoman Empire makes it further into Europe than it would have otherwise. Let's say at least into Germany. I find it difficult to imagine them conquering the UK. That seems
they couldn't take Europe, the whole thing, but I think they could take it maybe east of the Alps.
Right, exactly, something like that. So you get half Ottoman. So Eastern Europe becomes Islamic.
Yeah.
The church, let's say, remains in Rome or moves to Avignon again. And so you get a Western European rump base that is basically in a semi-feudal state. And then you get China. Where would China go? Would China go to Alaska? Would it go to the Western United States? What happens there?
Well, the thing about China is that for the longest time, they had no need to go anywhere because they had everything. They didn't really have any motivation to conquer. There's the famous pleasure fleets of the Zhang Empire, which went around and were essentially a propaganda effort by the Chinese Empire, but which never actually attempted to establish any geographic connections anywhere or hold anything, because that sort of contact is destabilizing. And the empire had a vested unifying interest in preventing destabilizing innovations. And so I think that's why they would probably be the least likely to, or the last power to, in this context, try to seek the vacuum. But if you assume things keep, we're talking about class societies under constant pressure, they're going to continue to create contradictions that are going to continue to undermine them, and they're going to seek stability somewhere. And so I think they would eventually, probably crawl down the west coast of the United States. But again, I think at the very end of the process, they would be the ones coming up holding the rear.
Okay, so I just want to set the stage. It's 1800. We talked about the Western Hemisphere. We talked about half of Europe becoming Islamized. And we talked about China. Matt, it seems like you're saying they would probably not have done the same colonial expansion, right?
Yeah.
So when do these encounters happen? Because people know about peoples in the Western Hemisphere at this point, right? Not only were there these early things that gave the native peoples antibodies, but there were a failed British attempt to actually establish a beachhead, and there was a failed Spanish attempt to actually establish a beachhead. So what happens? Alex, like you said, the book you were talking about, is there a reverse colonialism where the 200-year later Mexica society develops the navigational technologies, particularly because it's a lake-based, water-based society, so there's pressures inherently there. Do they go to the rump Western Catholic Europe? What happens? Let's play it out.
I would say that before you get any kind of conflict, because you can't have like a war unless you know who you're fighting, you'd have to have a process of sounding out. So I think what you would have is the creation of diplomatic embassies and a sort of a recognition of sovereignty, and then trade relationships based on that. the same way that Europe encountered China and Japan, where they were required to because they faced an entrenched social order that they could not overthrow. So they dealt with them in a position, an assumed position of equals in a diplomatic field, and then negotiated for things like trade rights. And I think that there would be the establishment first of trade connections between the Americas and Europe, which would have their own destabilizing effects that we can't even begin to predict. But, once again, if we don't assume some sort of technological fix to the crises that are endemic to both systems, somebody's getting invaded eventually.
Well, so that's my question, right? Like, because you don't get the Enlightenment, or you don't get the Enlightenment in the same way, I don't think you get that obsession with individualism that comes to define North Atlantic liberalism and North Atlantic capitalism. So you also have almost a different mind space, generally speaking. And so, Alex, could you talk maybe a little bit about, like, we talk in academia about like indigenous ways of knowing and things along those lines, but like, how would that have played out if there's no colonial encounter? Do you get a whole different mind geography? And how does that mind geography come into contact eventually with an Islamized Eastern Europe, a China that has a totally different relationship to world power because of no Western colonialism? I'd like to talk a little bit about the ideologies as opposed to the material for a moment.
Well, the world you guys have set up, this was like our last chance for multipolarity. So I hope you're proud of yourselves. With the Chinese Empire and the Ottoman Empire and the Americas independent, that was our last chance. I think it's interesting because this is about thinking about encounters that, as Matt was saying, occur on an equal playing field, right? Like there's a respect and there's a recognition of these polities, sovereignties, right? And which is really rich, right? Because the usual Spanish, for a long time, the colonizer historiography of what happened in Mexico, for instance, the Spanish, is that the Spanish won because they were inherently culturally superior, because they had better communication skills, because they were quicker at adapting to interpreting changing reality, shit like that. Like something about their language and their culture allowed them to, and Cortés was supposed to be the master of signs and reading signs. But if you don't have that, and you have the diplomatic missions that Matt was talking about, it'd be really interesting to see what kind of unexpected syncretic mixtures of worldviews, of politics, of economics, of even religion occur. And that's really hard to fathom, right? I think, for a Masewal revolution to take down the Mexica, that would entail them going against their entire cosmology, right? Because the superiority and the power and the legitimacy of the Mexican nobility was physically manifested in this massive city, Mexico Tenochtitlan, that had over 200,000 people. So for a revolution to even happen, they have to end the world as they know it, and they have to go against their gods. And what happens, and if they're able to accomplish that, it's hard for me to fathom what replaces that, right? Because this religion has been, and this cosmology has been created in relation to a very particular geography that's really, I don't know if you've been to Mexico City, right? It's crazy rains, crazy seasons. There's massive earthquakes and flooding. So it would be really interesting to see what would have come out of these encounters, right? Because they're going to borrow and take from one another, particularly if they're on an equal playing field, I think.
Right. So that makes me think, if you have a situation where you've got mounting class conflict in an unequal and destabilizing Mexican empire in a context of cultural contact with Europe, maybe Christianity becomes like the cultural language of resistance and defiance of this world that had been imposed on them and that they were now becoming alienated from.
It's another liberation theology.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting too. In that novel, when the Incas arrive and they take over Spain, they offer their religion as a much more egalitarian and forward-thinking religion, and they define themselves against the backward-looking, dark, mystical Catholicism that rules Spain.
Right. And I think that would happen in Europe too. That same diffusion would happen in that direction also. Dawn of Everything makes a pretty convincing case that one of the big contributors to the Enlightenment as a concept and the generation of notions of individual liberty as constitutive of social virtue came from encounters with North American natives and their social order, and that contact would also happen in any context that we're talking about here, and would have probably a similar role in being a catalyst for like new social thought to emerge, to challenge what we're stipulating here are unstable and declining political economies.
So let's talk for a second about industrialization, because you could have technological development in non-capitalist societies. We had it for the entirety of human existence. Do you think you get some sort of technological revolution anyway? Maybe it doesn't happen with the cotton gin, but maybe it happens in, 1900. What is the course of technology in this world? Because that is also crucial to this is why Marx thought capitalism was necessary for socialism. You needed to have these technologies. So assuming, and I think it's fair to assume that over time, all sides of the equation would develop technologies that allow for more calories, that allow for more surplus, that allow for more brain power to be spent on development of abstract thought. What happens in this world in terms of industrialization?
I think you do not get industrial capitalism as we understand it. You get, though, and we've seen, like, China is like the cliche example here. You see the emergence of technologies in basically any social context where there's surplus to be accumulated and experimented with, basically. But it cannot be organized around a central goal anywhere outside of the competitive state framework because of its destabilizing role. But that destabilizing role is in the context of class societies. If we're imagining that we are able to, achieve an agrarian communism that is now encountering, because there's still these state projects that are in conflict and in cooperation with one another. So there's still the business of state. There's still bureaucracy. There is still governance of some kind, or else these places wouldn't be able to establish and maintain territorial integrity.
And which are developing before colonialism. I mean, you have an increasing sophistication of these technologies.
And so these state structures, more egalitarian, but still structures that like marshal efforts and direct them, are going to now be encountering the same sort of eureka, aha, black swan technological innovations that happened under capitalism. Not as fast and not as like rapidly, more sort of stochastically. But once they emerge, energy can be directed towards them. So I think you still do get the kindling of a technological society, but it's one that is at every point restrained by a dominant social concept and a social identity that prevents technology from basically ripping off its tethers and becoming ungovernable, which is what basically immediately happens under capitalism.
So we get
the sorcerer's apprentice effect.
Right, an unalienated form of technological development where we control the technology and the technology doesn't control us. But do you guys think that there would be wars between these encounters, or are we positing that without this sort of brutality of colonialism and capitalism and Enlightenment thinking and liberalism, that's why I was trying to emphasize the mind space, because I think that's actually crucial to appreciating how the Ottoman post-Mexica society would interact when they come into contact in a more sustained way in 1830, for example, as opposed to 1519.
Yeah, I think there would still be conflict, right? But I think one of the really interesting things that comes out of thinking about how the Mexica fought against the Spanish is the way they fight, right? And the way that war is thought of and conceptualized is really important, right? So when the Mexica fought the Spaniards, because of Mexica cosmology and religion, they fought not to kill, right? But they fought to capture, right? Because for them, the most prized captives to sacrifice were other warriors. So when the 400 Spanish are attacking their city and like 200,000 indigenous allies, these Mexica warriors are trying to capture the Spanish. I said they don't fight. They don't have conflict to kill, at least on the battlefield. They're having conflict to capture. There's accounts of Mexica like armies marching off to a city, a rival city state, and if that city state didn't have enough weapons, the Mexica would give them weapons, because for them, if there wasn't a fair fight, there's no honor in it, and it kind of defeats the purpose of them capturing these prize captives for sacrifice. Whereas the Spanish, in this, centuries of Reconquista warfare, they didn't mind, pointing a cannon at a bunch of civilians and blowing them to smithereens, right? They didn't give a shit about that. So it would be really interesting to think about, like, if their methods of war changed or they remain the same, minus the European conception of warfare that gets brought over via colonialism. Right. So this idea in 1830s, you have different, like these Mexica stateless communes fighting against the Ottomans. It'd be interesting to think about like their conceptions of war and conflict, how they differ, and then now how that will shape the outcome of this type of conflict. But there's still going to be conflict. The question is like, what's at stake? What are they fighting over?
Right. Yeah.
Why are they fighting over this stuff? And then how do they legitimize that type of conflict and war to their own population?
Yeah. I would imagine that it would be a similar situation to conflict in Europe, in that you're fighting over territory and economic emollients one way or the other. And that war is politics by another means. It's another way to try to gain advantage in that sort of constant struggle for resources. But I think it would stay at that level. It would not reach the existential level that the colonial endeavor did.
And we're essentially saying, to underline it, that there's an inherent eradicatory or eradication-centered element of Western warfare. And that's the ideology that winds up dominating military history after the 16th century, because it's an arms race. It's an ideological arms race. If the Mexica don't respond with similar extermination practices, then there's no way that they're going to win. So the colonial encounter going away, at least in the way that it happened here, would transform, the various ways of war. So it seems like that would. Sorry, Alex, please.
No, so to interrupt, and that mentality of war will then make its way into other things like labor, right? So that brings in, this allows us to bring in an area that we haven't talked about much, but like what Africa is doing at this moment, and like how Africa and these different powerful African kingdoms develop absent the slave trade. Because a lot of Caribbean scholars, particularly those like Vincent Brown, who writes about these Jamaica, right? He conceptualizes slavery as like an everyday form of warfare that is very European and that views labor in that same type of eradicatory form, right? Because they know that it's cheaper for them to work a slave to death in 2 years and then just resupply the plantation or that economy with more slaves coming from most parts of Africa, right? So without that, then Africa, I think, and these different African kingdoms have a really important role to play in this hypothetical as well.
So it does seem like the colonial encounter as it proceeded was not the greatest thing in the world. Without it, we would be living in social harmony today. We'd already be on the moon. We'd already be expanding throughout the universe. We could go on with this one for a while, but any final thoughts on the colonial encounter happening differently?
Yeah, just that it does really feel like the lack of a connection between discovery and recognition, which was impossible because of the way it occurred. It really did put mankind in a pretty deep hole that it's very hard to imagine them climbing out of.
Wasn't great.
Yeah.
Oh, there's no West. I mean, that's the thing that I think about this idea of what constitutes the West on a variety of different levels, right? There is no West.
Yeah.
And this is the foundational moment. And without that, then we come up with all sorts of hypotheticals like we have today. And it probably would look like, well, I don't know, but I still think it would look much more multipolar than what happened in practice.
Well, I mean, we would actually have to solve our problems socially. We would have to look within. We could. There's not a frontier to hypnotize ourselves with. And
there's no U.S. So there you go.
Yeah, that's the real thing. Is there's no one place to just catch all of the drippings from the pan and turn it into a demi-glace.
So me and Matt would be living somewhere in Germany as neighbors. Alex, where would you be in this world?
Who the hell knows, man? I don't know. either one of these communes.
Yeah, we would all be on Mars.
We would all be on Mars living on space Mexica communes.
Spartan Mars, yeah. Spartan Mexica Mars, yeah.
Yep.
All right, guys. Thanks so much, and we'll see you all next week. Bye.
Bye-bye. In a world where points depend on hinges,
there are hinge points inside us all.
history on a Segway.
It's overdetermined.
We are the points that our hinges have been seeking.
What this podcast asks is, what if?
Agriculture. Fail or epic win?
What if it was Johnny Vango Pit?
What if the Ottomans had AK-47s?
Maybe climate change was a good idea.
What if the Ottomans had lightsabers?
What if the buffalo killed us?
What if Santa Claus was real, like an actual guy who gave presents every year? This is Hinge Points.
Hello, everyone, and welcome again to Hinge Points. I'm Danny Bessner, here as always with Matt Christman, and we are excited to welcome to the podcast today Patrick Wyman. You probably already know him, but if you don't, Patrick is the author of a really excellent book that recently came out titled The Verge, Reformation, Renaissance in 40 Years That Shook the World, and he's also a podcaster, and his podcast is Tides of History, and it's really excellent, and everyone who is interested in history, and I assume you are, because you are listening to it, should absolutely check it out. And today we are going to talk about a really, I would say, one of the most important hinge points in history, and that concerns Martin Luther.
Nailing a notice to the door of the church was not unusual. Among those waiting to be forgiven and blessed, none could know that this document would become one of the most widely read in all history.
The original poster, I believe, Patrick, as you called him, who was very crucial to shaping Europe, Christianity, and everything in between. So what we're going to suppose on this podcast is, what if Martin Luther didn't become Martin Luther? What if he passed away as a young man, and how that might have affected things? But before we do that, Patrick, could you set the scene about why individually, as a person, as a man, Martin Luther is so important to history?
So I would say the fact that I view Martin Luther as being this individually important should stand out, because I am not an individuals matter all that much in history type of person. I think that the vast majority of the historical figures with whom we're familiar, that we tend to think like, this person mattered a lot, like inventor of the cotton gin, for example. I think most people are completely replaceable. I think if you look at this exact same period, Christopher Columbus, completely replaceable with any one of a number of, ships captains who was wandering around the ports of Western Europe around 1490, who was into slavery and making a profit. No difference at all to the historical outcome. Martin Luther is special for a few reasons. First of all, because of his ability to write in both Latin and the vernacular. He could speak to both popular audiences and to the educated elite across Europe, which meant that instead of his complaints about the church sticking among the kind of educated elite of people who were interested in that stuff, an educated elite that had existed for centuries. The church was always in the process of being reformed, but usually it's stuck within this relatively small, highly educated international group. Luther's ability to speak in punchy, entertaining terms to a mass audience, and not just to speak to that audience, but literally to create it through selling printed pamphlets to them. He created an entire reading public that was an audience for reform in a way that could not have existed if it was, say, Erasmus, who was the second most popular author of this particular period of time. Erasmus was not talking to your average German burgher who was, sleeping off a hangover, walks down to the market and is thinking about, I got to check the exchange rates. I got to see what the price of pork is today. And maybe I'll pick up a pamphlet. That guy's not picking up an Erasmus pamphlet. He would pick up a Martin Luther pamphlet because he would know there'd be some cool woodcut illustrations in there, probably showing the devil. There's going to be some really entertaining language. This is going to be a thing that it's not just that it speaks to this person's concerns about his soul, which he does have, but also that it's going to entertain him. And printers know that Martin Luther's name sells. So the early Reformation, at least, is as much a product of Martin Luther's individual ability to write and reach audiences as it is about his particular theological concerns. And his kind of pugnacious attitude, the way that he approaches debate and church reform, winds itself into the DNA of the Reformation in a way that it would not have necessarily if there were another driving figure. Like, Luther was a really unpleasant guy, and he understood the world in oppositional terms. And
sounds like the original poster.
He really is. Luther would have thrived on Twitter. And I know, like, we make that joke, but he really would have. his entire way of understanding the world emerged from oppositional thinking. He wasn't like John Calvin, where he writes this big, constantly updated book of his theology, where he's talking about, this is what I think about this, and this is what I think about this. It was very much like Luther would write a thing, somebody would write another thing, Luther would get really mad about that, and then write his response. So if you're trying to piece together what Luther actually thought about any individual theological issue, you have to go through this like sea of polemic and him just being really mad at first this cardinal and then this priest and then this other guy. Like, Luther being mad is not separable from the theological meat of the early Reformation.
And Luther being mad is one of the things that makes people want to read him.
Exactly.
And as we said, that is why Luther is not fungible the way that Columbus is. Because yes, as Patrick actually wrote a really good article about Columbus, pointing out that like he is replacement level in any way, like in every way. Like he is as talented, as able as any of those guys who are running out trying to make money in the Atlantic. Whereas when you look at the people who end up being called to arms by Luther and forming the first rank of reformers, there's not one of them who you could imagine doing what Luther did. I mean, my God, Philip Melanchthon, the biggest nerd in world history, just this like asthmatic little dork, like who shrinks from all confrontation. She sure as hell isn't going to be the first one blasting the trumpet against the whore of Babylon. So that makes me think, yes, like there are very few individuals in history who we can really put a lot consequentially on their shoulders, and we can just kind of agree Martin Luther is one of them. So what if, in that July night of 1505, when he was walking back to his hometown after from his studies in law at Erfurt, and he was caught in a rainstorm. And in our timeline, he runs under a tree, he's almost hit by lightning, and he prays to God in that moment to save him and promises that if he will become a monk.
Plötzlich schlägt der Blitz direkt neben ihm ein. Der starke Luftdruck schleudert ihn zu Boden. In Todesangst ruft er: Hilf, heilige Anna, und ich will ein Mönch werden.
And then he survives the night and does in fact go on to defy his father's wishes and become a theology student. Now that is probably an embellished account that he added things to later to sort of, burnish his legend. But let's assume that like he was caught in a terrifying thunderstorm that made him sort of think about his soul for a minute. Let's say that instead of him hiding under that tree until the storm ended, he absolutely gets a response from God in the form of a lightning bolt to the forehead and just is dead there in the field. So what happens in Europe in the early 16th century with the same material conditions that we have now, with the rising commercial economies of the cities of Europe, rising literacy, along with the adoption of printing technology and a print media, and a real current, a constantly churning current of resistance to the church's secular and temporal authority. We have that same conditions, but we do not have this singular genius to channel it the way that he did. What do we think would be different?
So I think the biggest difference is going to be that church reform does not become a mass popular movement in the way that it does with Martin Luther.
Patrick,
I think
maybe before we continue, could you actually explain to people who might not be aware, the church was able to very successfully integrate previous polemic, right? So like something is different with Luther. Could you just give a brief précis on how that worked?
Absolutely. Yeah. Sorry. So basically the whole history of the medieval church is the history of reform movements. There's always somebody in some corner of Christendom saying, we're not doing this right. This particular belief is not, like, the bishops aren't taking care of their flocks. The monks are having sex with too many women. There's too much luxury happening here. Like, every monastic order that you've heard of emerges in response to some complaint about the direction the church is going. That's how the Franciscans show up. That's how the Dominicans show up. That's how the entire concept of a friar emerges out of medieval dissatisfaction. The concept of sacraments, like actual, like, defined sacraments, emerges out of these reform movements. The concept of heresy emerges out of reform movements. And basically, the difference between a reformer and a heretic really depends on who your local bishop is, who the pope is at the time, and what kind of the prevailing political conditions are. So sometimes, these guys end up becoming saints of the church. That's what happens to St. Francis, even though almost immediately his whole no property thing gets ignored.
That one's pushed aside.
Yeah, literally within years of his death, that one's pushed to the side. But then you end up with guys like Jan Hus, who get burned at the stake. And sometimes you get cases where you have somebody who is condemned in their lifetime and then celebrated as a saint after their death. So there's really not a lot of rhyme or reason to this stuff. It's really kind of a local thing. The way I like to think of it is that the medieval church is a big tent. There is an incredible amount of variation contained within medieval Christendom. So the church has to be a big tent. You've got everything from, monk warriors who were beheading Muslim captives on the deck of a ship to illiterate priests with 7 children living out somewhere in the French countryside. That's all part of the church. That's all under the same umbrella. So what makes the church a genius institution that is incredibly flexible and durable over the course of the Middle Ages is that it's able to channel reforming energy, is that it's able to say, yeah, you know what, we are going to do this a little bit different. You know what? Okay, yeah, we're going to let this king do this particular thing here, and we're gonna rein in this king over here. So in Spain, for example, by this time, they're basically running a national church with very little input as to how things are run. The Spanish Inquisition is a royal institution; it is not a papal institution. So I think in the absence of Martin Luther, we still end up with a more nationally divided church and much more nationally fragmented religious landscape. But it ends up looking a lot more like what happens in England with Henry VIII, where you just have kings slowly taking more and more and more authority away from the church, taking monastic lands, taking this and that, taking the ability to appoint bishops, and the Pope becoming a less relevant figure. I think it's harder for the Pope to exercise any sort of authority in a more politically and theologically fragmented Europe with the printing press, but it doesn't become the kind of mass evangelical movements that we see with Luther.
Okay, so that raises an interesting question. If you do get, by necessity, these top-down reformations, which I think we all agree would be necessary because that centrifugal pull away from the centralizing authority of the Pope, that's happening regardless of whether Luther exists, and the explosion of state conflict that this period sees is going to necessitate that. But if you don't have a mass evangelical movement that is communicated through popular literature, does that mean that the religious distinction between the reformers and people who prefer the old way ends up being polarized along class and the folk religion of Europe everywhere remains Catholicism, while this sort of nationally aligned church is the domain of the bourgeois and landowners who got together to resist papal authority in the first place?
So I think it's going to vary an incredible amount depending on where you are in Europe. I mean, and appealing to regionalism is kind of a cop-out in this period, but really I think there would be a huge difference depending on whether you were sitting in the city of London and you've got an active Bishop of London and Archbishop of Canterbury sitting right there trying to ride herd on what the common people are doing in terms of their religious beliefs versus, out in the Cotswolds where nobody's really paying attention and you've still got people with copies of Wycliffe's writings that have been passed down for 150 years, right? I think that it's going to depend a lot on where royal reach goes and where kind of a national church's reach can go. Because, even in increasingly religiously centralized England during the English Reformation, there are places where there are still tons and tons of secret Catholics for generations and generations and generations afterwards. And I think that, but I think that you're right in pointing to a class dimension to that, to the extent that the class dimension is mapping onto these increasing divides that we see at this time between urban and rural, between an increasingly commercialized and internationalized city folk who are more and more tied to the crown versus what's happening out in the countryside, which is a much, much different kind of thing throughout the 16th and 17th century.
So another crucial thing is, it's interesting to imagine a Europe without the religious wars, because we talked on an earlier episode about how one of the major reasons that Europe winds up doing colonialism effectively is because those wars, really, I think those are the first early modern instantiation of them forced an incredible jump in technological development and military development and navigation and et cetera, et cetera. So what do you think, or to both of you, do you think you still get that violence, which is so crucial to the European story after the 16th century?
I think that is the question. It's not. It is, where does that violence reappear? What is its guise? Because I think you have to assume it's still there because all the social pressures are there. Luther just provided a specific conduit for them and a language for them. Like the peasant revolts that are kind of triggered in part by the new evangelical movement of the 1820s, that all of those deep conflicts that were coming to a boil between peasants and landlords during this period of like deep crisis and spiraling inflation and all this, that's still going to come out somewhere. And I guess the question becomes, if it's not going to be religious, do we get an acceleration of like the articulation of a secular politics, a secular mass politics that took longer to develop, perhaps because it had to go through its like religious transformation first?
I kind of wonder, now that we're talking about this and as we're getting into it, the language of mass resistance throughout the Middle Ages was already very heavily couched in religious terms.
Yeah.
Right. And so I'm kind of wondering whether you end up with whether like, okay, so let's take Luther out of the equation. Is there going to be a Thomas Müntzer at some point?
Right. Is there a Reformation from below where you replace Luther's, singular genius and ability to translate information using this new technology with like smaller nodes around guys who aren't the genius that Luther was, but are able to communicate a similar like religious idea and truth through preaching. And by the fact that there are more of them, more embedded in like peasant communities that would they would like find out about each other and resonate off of one another's messages, you would have potentially like a reformation from below that sort of bypasses the gatekeeping functions of literacy.
Mm-hmm. I think that makes a lot of sense. Given so it's kind of hard for us to imagine this now in our present day, but to the extent that there were celebrities in kind of folk popular culture in the Middle Ages, they were often preachers. They were traveling preachers, especially Dominicans who were known to have a gift for this type of thing, and they were multimedia events, right? So you have handbills printed beforehand saying, we're gonna have a good get together. We're gonna put together a sermon. It's gonna be a real rollicking one. We're gonna have some fire and brimstone, and then we're all gonna get drunk afterward. This is great. They would do like plays and shit, right? And like performances and puppets and stuff. This is like the meat of social and folk life in the European countryside at the beginning of the 16th century. Like preachers
early mass culture type stuff.
Exactly. That's exactly the case. And afterward, the texts of these sermons are often printed and distributed. And so the sermons have a life beyond the immediate face-to-face interactions that go along with them. And so I think that you're very much onto something, Matt, when you're talking about a reformation from below, because those guys aren't going away. Right, like they're embedded in the fabric of society as it exists.
And like Thomas Müntzer, for example, was shaking the fucking trees and shit before Luther's polemics came out.
Yeah, and there's a real argument among scholars as to what debt Müntzer owes Luther, right? And what the relationship is between them, because you're going to get Müntzer figures, and like it. Given the social pressures of the time that you referenced, like there's no way that doesn't get couched in apocalyptic language and the language of what people owe to each other as the children of God.
And then this just, I think exactly, you're right. You have this language already, but the genius of Luther, Patrick, as you've expressed it to me, is this iterative ability, this ability to never stop posting, and this ability, I think, to keep on ratcheting up exponentially the fever of the social pressures that we're talking about. So the question is, I think we all agree that that's going to have a valve or some sort of escape valve. It's going to have to be expressed. But even as we talk about it, I don't see a clear direction about how that would be expressed, because without that iteration, you don't get that same emotional resonance that Luther himself provided, which is why the Reformation turns into this hyper-violent event.
Well, the thing is, it's a question of where the violence is going to go, because I really don't think that you can subtract any of the actual passion that went into the religious wars and the violence of them from people like all along the class structure of Europe. But absent like a popular Reformation, I don't know. Perhaps that violence expresses itself in like the more explicit class antagonistic models of the medieval English peasant revolts. When Adam, what was it? When Adam squatted or something, and Eve span when there was an Englishman, that kind of thing. And then also, Munster and stuff. Like, do you get a essentially a religiously infused war against the ruling classes of early modern, late feudal Europe?
And Patrick, this is my question to you then, just to build off Matt. Maybe you could explicate the relationship you see between the Reformation and very early capitalism.
Okay, so I want to come back to something real quick before we get into the Reformation and capitalism, which is Luther's relationship to authority, which I think kind of lies at the heart of the distinction between popular and top down. Like, one of the reasons why Luther ceases to be such a key figure after a really early point, like I think we're inclined to see Luther as the key figure of the Reformation, but after 1525 and definitely after 1530, other people are far more important. Luther increasingly becomes a regional figure. He's still read very widely in Germany, but not really anywhere else. The Reformation kind of moves beyond him. You can see this in the numbers of printed texts, the numbers of editions. Like, up through 1525, Luther is 10 times more popular. He's printed in 10 times more editions than the next most popular reforming author, right? After that, the numbers drop off dramatically. 3/4 of the editions of Luther's work are printed before 1530, right? And part of the reason for that is because when the Peasants' Rebellion happens in 1525, Luther takes a very strong stand against them, and his popularity dramatically diminishes. There's no way for the image that Luther likes to portray, likes to put out there of himself as this kind of kindly pastor who's looking after his flock. You can't square that with him saying that all of the peasants should be killed because they're blood-sucking rebels, right? Like, so Luther comes down very strongly on the side of authority. He's always got in the back of his mind this idea that anything coming from the bottom is inherently suspect and that people need to be controlled, that authority exists for a good reason.
And
right?
you could see just very quickly how Protestantism morphs into modern secular liberalism. It's there from the beginning. That skepticism of the masses. I'm very glad you brought that up. It's there in Luther.
Mm-hmm. It is central to understanding what made Luther in particular attractive as a reforming ally to the German princes, right? That if on the one hand you have Thomas Müntzer, you know that you can't keep going as you're going. You know that these reforming currents exist. If you're going to put your heart and your head behind some kind of church reform and, maybe squeeze a few secularized monasteries out of the deal, like, then Luther is the one you're going with. You're not going with Andreas Karlstadt. You're not going with Huldrych Zwingli. You're going with Luther, who has a firm respect for authority, like baked into his perspective. And so I think that's another thing that makes Luther unique, is that unlike a lot of these other reforming figures, he's very much on the side of existing social structures and existing power structures.
And that makes you wonder, like, so much of that class conflict that was coming to a head during that period ends up getting vented into this holy war against an imagined other who is defined in religious terms. And that means that so much of the common misery of being exploited under this failing system gets turned into a narrative of religious oppression rather than a recognition of one's subject position. And Luther shows up at the perfect moment to define the coming crisis in these religious terms. But if there is no Luther, there is still the crisis, and there are still going to be people among the grassroots of European society trying to make sense of what is happening, and they're going to come to a completely different understanding of the religious dimension of the conflict they're in, that might not look across borders and foreigners to make sense of what's happening to them, but actually look up at a ruling class that has essentially created a counterfeit Christianity that they cannot relate to, because they all define themselves as Christians, as Christianity was introduced to them as children, but they cannot square it with the world around them. And without Luther to essentially mystify them, perhaps they fight a war with all of the passion and coordinating capacity of the wars of religion, but as like a roiling series of peasant rebellions that have like a social cohesion because they're around a fully coherent class identified conception of Christianity.
And of course, Engels pointed to the 1525, rebellions as the first instantiation of class conflict. And so, Patrick, I wonder if you could talk about the relationship to capitalism. Like, imagine a world where the purchasing of indulgences, the problem wasn't the indulgences, but the purchasing itself. What relationship do you see Luther playing in the formation of the modern capitalist world?
Okay, so I think the first thing you got to know is that Luther is himself a product of that world from the very beginning, right? So Luther's father is a mine owner and operator. So his father from the very beginning is embedded in this world where everybody is taking out loans, where everything is increasingly financialized, and frankly, where small-time operators are being squeezed out by larger and larger ones. Like, it's not a coincidence that Luther as a figure, and Luther never trusted loans. I think you could probably look that as part of his like kind of ongoing conflict with his father, who was an incredibly unpleasant man by all accounts. Like that Luther called he was offered like shares at one point as like a financial reward. He called it Spielgeld. He called it like play money. He didn't think it was real. So Luther is already a product of this world. What makes Luther able to have a voice is the fact that printing presses exist, and printing presses are the absolute perfect encapsulation of kind of late 15th, early 16th century merchant capitalism, in that they are entirely speculative investments, right? They require high initial capital. They're financed via loans. When you put out a book or an edition, that is a speculative thing. You have to estimate what the market for that is going to be. It is a speculative venture that requires money up front. So printing is of its nature kind of a reflection of this. Luther is himself a reflection of this world. Now, I think when we're talking about how we get from Luther to capitalism, I think like the people that he's speaking to, the people who identify most strongly with Luther, are going to become the bourgeoisie. And I think, if anything, an identification with Luther's message as consumers of his message in print form is what creates a class consciousness among these people, that they are literate, they're highly urban, they're prosperous, they're upwardly mobile. They have an identity of their own that is tied to existing class structures. They may not be overly fond of their lords, but they do a lot of self-governance because they're part of city institutions, right? Like these are urban folk who are used to governing themselves. So they're not that concerned about the exactions of lords because, they're kind of living in their own independent world of free cities, right? So I think that's Luther's role. If we're thinking about capitalism, is like the bourgeoisie learns to understand what it is through reading Luther and through understanding that they're not the people at the bottom of the social spectrum. They're not the people at the top. They have their own distinct identity and their own distinct place in society.
So in some sense, what we're positing here, or what we're asking, is there a bourgeoisie absent Luther? So do the social forces that engender the Reformation and through Luther engender what sounds like to me in the earliest forms of liberalism that morphs into a secularism, and the bourgeoisie, do those social forces necessarily result in a bourgeoisie? And if they don't, what type of world are we imagining?
I don't think they necessarily end up in a bourgeoisie that thinks of itself as a reading public. That to me is the really key thing. That if you think that mass media plays an important role in the development of bourgeoisie as a class moving into the 17th and 18th centuries, I don't think it's a guarantee that they are readers of mass market information sans Luther. I think that's the key distinction, that like you can't overstate the extent to which printing as an industry came into its own because of selling Luther's books, right?
The average person, the average non-nerd, basically, who is going about their day trying to get those stacks in the urban environment and who was literate, had no conception of why he should sit down and read for edification or pleasure. It was not something that would have occurred to him. They needed the specific context of this guy speaking in lucid and entertaining, aesthetically pleasing prose, telling you, "Hey, you dummy, you're going to go to hell if you don't change X, Y, and Z." It's like it's a lightning bolt to like the basal stem of like identity. It's going to give you a new understanding of self that is going to be wired into this new collective consciousness of reading public.
Yeah, and it's not that it comes out of nowhere, right? Because like if you're an educated, kind of upwardly mobile clerk type living in Nuremberg in 1510, so before Luther is putting all this stuff out there, you can read. You read account books. You're doing double entry bookkeeping. You're looking at handbills that are posting new laws or regulations from the city council. You probably own a book of hours, right? So you can do your devotions, and depending on how high up you are on the urban social scale, that may be a more or less rich volume. So you can read. It's not that you have no concept of reading as a thing, but reading for pleasure and reading for edification, yes, that is something that is entirely foreign to you. Maybe you read a text of a sermon that you heard was a real banger, right? Like maybe that's what you're reading. But Luther is the one who's creating the idea, and through the printers, who is creating the actual genre of text, where sure, you go down to the marketplace and you're doing your haggling and you think, oh yeah, I've got a couple of coins in my pocket. Let me grab this. Let me grab the hot new Luther off the presses. Like that's not a thing that existed before. And Luther creates the concept of a reading public that is going to exist as a market for those kinds of texts afterwards.
So I think if we erase Luther and we erase that structure that creates this reading public, supercharges the creation of this self-conscious bourgeois, and also divides the oppressed peasantry along religious lines at precisely the moment that they're going to come into their most deeply crisis-riddled relationship to the mode of production they're enmeshed in. Instead of that, you might get sort of a reformation from below that must like eventually come into some sort of conflict with both the bourgeois as they exist and the landed aristocracy. And when I imagine that, I kind of think of, as we've talked about in the previous episodes of this season, what you're imagining here is a best case scenario where the escape valves that seem to emerge at every crucial point of crisis in European social order, starting at this period of like this technological inflection point. There are these moments where the social energies are becoming uncontainable within the system as it exists. And instead of that leading to the final like heightening of contradictions and conflict between classes, a new model emerges, a new social phenomenon emerges to redirect that. First, it's Protestantism, then the greater capitalist urbanizing project, and of course, then the crowning glory, the colonial project in North America, specifically. And all of those things seem to emerge at the precise historical nexus to preserve the contradictions within this thing so that they can essentially be worked out while retaining the existing social order and status quo, so that by the time you have capitalism take over for feudalism, it is not with class revolt. It is with this slow, over the centuries process of the ruling land-based classes being essentially bought out of their position by the bourgeois and being integrated to some extent into the broader bourgeois dictatorship. And that is why, the working class resistance to capitalism, when it emerges, is at every point stymied similarly, because this process continues throughout the history of the modern Europe. And so I think what I see looking back at all these hinge points is the best case scenario is one where the world got to meet itself on relatively equal terms. You know what I mean? Like, I think that capitalism is probably an inevitable outgrowth of human interaction on Earth. But if it had have developed in a globalized context, I think it's the likelihood that it could have been overcome without the complete destruction of like the biome becomes much more possible.
And what's really interesting to me is that we're imagining a world where the mind space of capitalism isn't developed in quite the same way. That's sort of, when you develop a reading public, you're essentially fostering and encouraging a form of abstract thinking, which I think a lot of scholars have shown is directly linked to the rise of early modern capitalism and imagining new types of worlds. But that has also been used in some way to organize working classes, of course, because mass literacy was also crucial. But if absent that sort of what would be this dissemination of literacy or the dissemination of a particular type of very abstract mind space, do you actually have a capitalism that is more organically connected to limits of geography, to limits of social relations and things like that, which to me is really interesting, because capitalism is ultimately about who controls the means of production, but it's also a way of knowing, right? A way of viewing the world.
I think a lot of it is going to end up being the same, because so much of the kind of mental architecture of capitalism is rooted in who owes who what. And that extends way up and down the social spectrum when we're talking about the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Like, I think there are really good arguments to be made that what we understand as a capitalist mindset was really widely shared across the social spectrum in that period of time, that I owe that everybody is thinking in monetary terms. Even if they don't have cash on hand, they're thinking in terms of who owes who what. Land is a widely fungible commodity across the social spectrum. It can be bought, sold, leased, put to use in a whole variety of different ways. Like, it's not that common lands don't exist anymore, but I think that even a common land is understood to have a specific value. So I think that's going to be there regardless. And so you're going to end up with something that looks like capitalism. But I mean, frankly, I find one of the most annoying aspects of the early modern mindset is the overwhelming moralism of it, and the kind of sense of self-righteous superiority that you get whenever you're reading any sort of early modern capitalists talk about like self-identified capitalists talk about themselves and talk about their understanding of the world. And like, I think there's a chance that without the Protestant Reformation, without the creation of that particular kind of reading public, you end up with a slightly more humble way of understanding the world and coming to terms with it.
Right. Because what Protestantism did was it gave people essentially permission to be unchristian to one another.
Yeah.
Because it introduced gradations into like being a Christian that hadn't existed under the Catholic Church, and that therefore allowed you to rank people by their piousness, and therefore accrue different degrees of social obligation to them based on that. And so you could rip people off, which you have to do if you're going to be a capitalist, and you have to make sense of that. If you're so damn moral, how can you do this all day? And Protestantism is there to provide a narrative.
There's a lot to dislike about the medieval church, but one of the things to like is the idea that, like, even if they didn't follow through on it, right? Like a usurer merchant capitalist was still worried about the state of his soul. Right. Like he needed
the church to keep him out of hell because he knew what he'd done.
Yeah. He still needed to worry that, like, he runs afoul of the wrong Franciscan, and that guy's going to stand outside his offices screaming about how his soul is going to be pecked apart by 1,000 demons for all of eternity. Like, there is a powerful social force in medieval Christianity that at least says you need to feel a little bit bad about this if you're going to rip people off. Now,
it's sinful.
Yeah, it didn't stop them. It obviously didn't stop them, but like, just having to worry about it even a little bit.
It was a constraint. What it was a social constraint. And then once you get Protestantism, it becomes a social compulsion. It goes in the exact opposite way. Instead of offering resistance, it compels you in the other direction and actually requires you to do these things, to do these things that were formerly sins that required you to as you said, to restrain yourself, to be humble in your ambitions. And it limited the number of people who were willing to go the extra mile that defines the capitalist like bidding system. And you get a 180-degree shift in the incentive structure in the social order with Protestantism.
Yeah, it's one of the things where when you talk about, like, when does capitalism emerge, right? And you can go any period of history, go back to the fucking Bronze Age, and you're going to find capitalists, right? Like, you're going to find people who are recognizably doing things that we understand as flowing from a capitalist mindset in terms of the productive use of assets, understanding, selling low and buying high. Like, people get that. People have understood that for a very long time. But when you get capitalism, I think, is only when you reach a critical mass of people saying that it's okay to rip other people off, like that, and that not just okay but laudable.
And Zach.
So then Patrick and Matt. So this is the question then: is capitalism without that impulse capitalism? Or is there a form of a Christianized capitalism in the 16th century that then, takes us off in a million different directions?
Yeah. It's a really good question. And there are a lot of scholars who would say no, right? Like Martha Howell wrote this book, Commerce Before Capitalism, where she writes about how, like you have these things that recognizably look capitalist, but without that kind of crowning ideological thing, it's not really capitalism. I think it's close enough that you got to call it capitalism because the relationships are there, right? And the way of thinking is there, even if
and the medium state competitive framework isn't going anywhere. And that's the thing that drives all of it. That's what drives everybody to become capitalists in spite of themselves. And that doesn't go away either. So yeah, I think maybe you get like greater friction to that like transition. And that means greater conflict. And that's why I think you get probably a pull away from like the creation of the dynastic, powerful modern states, because they kind of wear themselves into oblivion in this constant conflict with their own peasant class and their own like bourgeois that cannot be resolved now.
And also just to drill down on Luther, and maybe this is ridiculous, but you can imagine a Germany absent religious wars uniting hundreds of years before. So then you get another power base in continental Europe able to go up against France and the United Kingdom, and then maybe do a form of internal land colonialism as the Germans always did. So what do you think the effects on Germany itself would be absent a Reformation?
I think that's another one of those things that depends a lot on who becomes Holy Roman Emperor. And so I think a Charles V type who was able to spend more time in the Holy Roman Empire, like actually, riding herd on things, and who wasn't constantly worried about religious warfare and having to placate one set of princes versus another, that becomes a much more coherent block. Like there's still a lot of internal contradictions and friction within the Holy Roman Empire, right? Like it is an institutional nightmarish maze. Like
it's deeply fucked by the time Luther shows up.
Yeah, it's just like, I mean, there are people who have spent their entire lives studying the Holy Roman Empire in the 15th and 16th centuries who still can't explain at a basic level what it is, like, or how it works. Like, and I think there's a lesson there, that like people who were, existing within it couldn't make sense of it. And they were just kind of like, well, I guess that's the way things are. So I think that's possible, but I think it would have taken, like, there's an extent to which Napoleon is kind of the sine qua non of like rationalizing Germany, because you just kind of need somebody who's going to sweep everything away and be like, okay, we're done. We're doing something new. There's just so much institutional resistance to any sort of change or reform in the Holy Roman Empire.
Yeah. I mean, if this conflict that we're saying is still going to emerge, right? Like say there is this peasant resistance that just rises up and cannot be contained and develops its own grassroots religious character, wouldn't there be a kind of a natural alliance then to be had between the emperor and the peasantry against the restive princes and the fucking whiny bourgeois, who are the ones pulling against the fetters of the Catholic Church and also the empire itself? Yeah. And then you have like a populist Habsburg imperium that is able to actually assert power over all of Germany.
Yeah, I think that's a possible outcome, especially if you still have the Ottomans pressing in.
Right.
If you have,
and you got to assume they'd still be there, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, and again, that's the other major counterfactual in this period is what if things go very slightly different at one of the sieges of Vienna? Like, then you end up with a dramatically different portrait of what Europe could look like.
Patrick, in a previous episode, we already posited an Islamized Eastern Europe. It seems like that really could have happened very easily.
But yeah, like if we're talking about like there being like this roiling class war in Germany that is picking up steam and not being vented, into warfare that at the end of the day increased state capacity, right? Mm-hmm. And the ability, therefore, to, compete with the Ottomans. I mean, it was only after they'd sort of the Habsburgs had buffed themselves fighting in Europe for 30 years that they were able to come back and actually start putting a lick on the Ottomans. Like, they didn't start winning until after they had nearly been destroyed fighting each other, because it built this new state machinery. if that's not happening because of this internal turmoil, does that not give the Ottomans this opportunity to really like cut into the belly of Europe? And if that happens, then I think that that state competitive framework that is always there, it finally gets subsumed in like a generalized rallying around some sort of central authority. Probably it would kind of have to be the Holy Roman Emperor against this invasion. The same dynamic that kept the Chinese Empire intact for 2,000 years. The threat of nomadic horsemen, your northern frontier. The Ottomans play that role in this scenario and actually force like a European sort of European-wide a real Holy League with like actual sovereign authority at the top.
Yeah, I think what you probably end up with is one of the kings of France becoming Holy Roman Emperor.
That makes sense. Absolutely. Yeah, it'd have to be headquartered in France.
Yeah, it's the richest, largest, most populous kingdom.
Exactly,
I think that's probably what you end up with, and that doesn't mean that dynastic rivalries go away. But if you're faced with the threat of annihilation and extinction, it's not going to be the Pope, because the Pope, regardless of Luther, leaving Luther aside, the Pope is increasingly just an Italian prince with a fancy hat, right? Like that's, the moral authority of the papacy, one way or the other, is effectively gone by the time Luther's publishing this stuff anyway. Like nobody is really taking the Pope that seriously as a moral arbiter by 1517.
Okay, so say we get in this no Luther world with like increased conflict within polities and an increased threat from the Ottomans, instead of the Charles V being the would-be universal monarch, it's Francis I. Mm-hmm. And he's actually successful where Charles was unable to succeed.
That's another really fascinating one, is what if Jakob Fugger doesn't come through? Like, what if Maximilian, the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian, dies a little bit earlier before he's able to make arrangements to get Jakob Fugger to make the loans to Charles based on hawking his Spanish properties to purchase the office? Then it's definitely Francis I, and suddenly the map of Europe, like the history of Europe at that point, looks a lot different. Yeah. Like that's like.
Do you get a proto-Napoleon? I mean, it just seems like someone would, absent Luther, sweep over part of Germany or incorporate Germany in a more coherent way.
It would have to be France.
Basically was made impossible.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then you get these gigantic Plauerbachs.
It would be a refusing of the old Holy Roman Emperor, which was the center of gravity was in France, and it shifted over the centuries into Germany. But it was started off being centered in France itself.
Yeah.
So at this moment, you would get a Franco-German alliance, the Ottomans in the East, you would get a burgeoning United Kingdom. How do you think that would affect the future of European colonialism, which is happening at this exact moment with an entirely new power arrangement of Europe?
I think you'd probably get some sort of Protestant-style Reformation vastly later and in the Low Countries in England, like headquartered there.
Yeah.
Because eventually, just you'd have such a critical mass of urbanized, literate people, and a critical mass of crisis and conflict and resistance to a centralizing authority, that I think you'd get some sort of a language, something like Protestant, like capitalist infused Protestantism, to emerge then, but like much later and probably much less able to assert authority over the rest of Europe. Although who knows, maybe there's this flight to early colonialism from like the early capitalist Low Countries and United Kingdom.
Right. Do you get colonialism basically? Or what? I think you do, but what is that character of that colonialism absent a Reformation?
I mean, I think you end up with you definitely end up with globalized capitalism, right? Like the center of financial gravity running between London, Antwerp, and the rest of the Low Countries is not like, that's not going to change. Like there's no changing the fact that the North Sea is going to be the kind of the major commercial and financial entrepot of the rest of the 16th and 17th centuries. So I think you still end up with that being the place where global cash is funneled through. And like, it's hard to overstate in this period the extent to which like London and the Low Countries are basically one thing, and the rest of England is kind of off doing its own other stuff. Like those places are tied to London, but commercially the relationship is London and the Low Countries. And so like the ties are just too tight there. I mean, like the merchant communities are essentially one community of people. They all know each other, right? Like that's all, like this is all one world. And so when the reforming stuff is happening in the 16th century and in our normal timeline, those are the networks that it's flowing along. Is, a merchant in Antwerp sending a copy of Luther's writings to a merchant in London. So when this reform stuff is happening, like, that's how it's happening to start with. Like, that's not going anywhere, Luther or not,
But the character, to me, and maybe I'm wrong, still is very different.
Oh yeah.
Then you have that because I do see the Reformation as providing pressure for colonialism. It's a way to sort of those peasant wars that break out in the first half of the 16th century. One of the reasons that they're ended is that you're able to send people places, and so absent that sort of same pressure, I'm not sure if colonialism proceeds in the exact same way. But maybe I'm missing something there.
I think you still get North American English colonies. Dutch ones too, but how well they're able to extend that, how far they're able to push it, how many resources they're able to devote in a context where they are facing like a continental hegemon and not a bunch of other modern, like relatively similar sized states in a general competitive framework with one another. I don't know.
You wonder in that context too whether Spanish colonization ends up as a much more state-directed project rather than the form it actually took. Right, the Spanish were kind of notoriously lax about what the first generation of conquistadors about exercising control over them. Does the Spanish colonial project look more like the Portuguese one, where it's a direct arm of the state that's being tightly controlled by kind of a clique of Seville merchants who are like in working in close cahoots with the crown, instead of it being like a bunch of second son psychopaths running off and tearing down New World empires.
We will then control all of New Spain, and we will stage history as others stage plays.
That's kind of another interesting counterfactual. And what if assuming even those conquests still happen, what if you aren't funneling that money into just immediately pouring it down the drain of massive trans-European warfare? Like the treasures of the Inca are literally immediately melted down and used to pay soldiers. Like they don't even They don't even sit there for weeks before they're used to pay soldiers. Like that's a much different looking Europe too.
Yeah, the one that isn't so kind of wastefully invested in the military sector.
So on that note, Patrick, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. This was great.
Thank you for having me. It's wonderful talking to y'all.